What remains of the ancient world is not what once existed, but what managed to survive. Across continents, fragments of lost civilizations stand in isolation. Structures without context, cities without complete histories, and designs that no longer reveal their original intent. These are not complete systems, but remnants shaped by time, erosion, and disappearance. Entire chapters are missing, leaving behind only partial evidence of something larger and more complex. The deeper we examine these sites, the clearer it becomes that we are not observing a finished past, but the remains of one. What we call history is built from what is left, not what was whole. Until those missing portions are understood, the ancient world remains incomplete, defined as much by what is gone as by what still stands. The discovery began not with myth, but with silence, an untouched palace buried on the eastern edge of Crete. In 1961, Greek archaeologist Nikolaos Platon excavated what would become known as Zakros Palace, the fourth major palace of the Minoan civilization. Unlike Knossos or Phaistos, Zakros had never been rebuilt after its destruction around 1450 BCE. What Platon uncovered was not a ruin shaped by centuries of reuse, but a system frozen at the exact moment it failed. Within its walls lay hundreds of clay tablets, thousands of ceilings, and entire rooms dedicated not to ritual, but to storage and control. The most unsettling detail was not their presence, but their organization. These were not scattered remnants of writing. They were grouped, categorized, and isolated in specific architectural zones, suggesting something far more advanced, a structured archive. And yet, the script inscribed across these tablets, Linear A, remains unreadable to this day. We are left with a complete system of information and no access to its meaning. The deeper the excavation progressed, the clearer the contradiction became. Bronze Age societies, typically characterized by limited literacy and localized administration, were not expected to produce centralized data systems. In Mesopotamia, for example, cuneiform archives from cities like Ur or Mari consisted of thousands of tablets, but their distribution was often tied to temples or individual scribal households. Even in Egypt, administrative papyri were fragile, decentralized, and rarely preserved in situ. Zakros, by contrast, presents something different, a spatially integrated archive embedded within a palace, combining storage, authentication, and controlled access. This raises the first unresolved question: how did a society, without a fully deciphered writing system, develop what appears to be a multi-layered bureaucratic structure? The tablets themselves provide indirect evidence. Their sizes are relatively standardized, often ranging between a few centimeters to palm-sized formats, suggesting predefined uses, inventory, transactions, or allocations. Many are accompanied by clay ceilings impressed with intricate designs, animals, abstract symbols, and composite motifs. These are not decorative. Statistical analysis of seal repetition shows that certain seal types recur across multiple rooms, while others are restricted to specific zones. This implies a system of identity encoding each seal, potentially representing an individual, an office, or a functional role. In modern terms, this resembles access control. Unlike the cylindrical seals of Mesopotamia, which rolled continuous images across clay, Minoan seals were stamped, discrete, and highly variable. At Zakros, over 500 unique seal types have been identified. The probability of such diversity emerging without a controlled administrative framework is extremely low. It suggests intentional differentiation, possibly a hierarchy of permissions, Some seals appear only in high storage zones, others in peripheral rooms, hinting at layered authority within the system. But the most paradoxical aspect of the archive lies in its material. The tablets were never meant to survive. They were made of unfired clay, soft, temporary, designed for short-term use. In Mesopotamia, such tablets were routinely recycled, dissolved back into clay after their purpose expired. Yet at Zakros, these tablets endured for over 3,400 years. The reason is accidental. The palace was destroyed by fire, likely during the widespread Late Bronze Age collapse around 1450 BCE. Temperatures exceeding several hundred degrees Celsius effectively fired the clay, transforming fragile records into ceramic artifacts. However, not all tablets were affected equally. Some show partial firing, others complete vitrification. A subset exhibits pre-exposure to heat edges hardened more than their cores. This irregularity has led to speculation that certain tablets may have been intentionally placed near heat sources before the final destruction. If true, it would suggest an awareness, however limited, that heat could enhance durability. No direct evidence confirms this as a standardized practice, but the pattern is difficult to ignore. The architecture surrounding the archive introduces another layer of complexity. Zakros is not the largest Minoan palace, covering approximately 8,000 square meters, significantly smaller than Knossos, which exceeds 20,000. Yet its internal layout is unusually compartmentalized. Instead of vast ceremonial halls, Zakros contains clusters of narrow rooms connected by controlled corridors. Many of these rooms contain large storage jars, pithoi each capable of holding hundreds of liters of oil, grain, or wine. These are not randomly placed containers. Their positioning suggests logistical planning. Fixed storage units aligned with wall structures, often adjacent to rooms containing tablets and ceilings. The implication is clear. Physical goods and their recorded data were co-located. Inventory was not abstract. It was spatially anchored. In modern logistics, this is fundamental. Data follows storage. Comparative studies reinforce this interpretation. At Knossos, storage and administration are present, but heavily intertwined with ceremonial architecture. At Phaistos, storage areas exist but lack the same density of ceilings and tablets. Zakros stands apart as a site where economic control appears to dominate architectural design. Some scholars have proposed that Zakros functioned as a maritime trade hub, its eastern position facilitating contact with the Near East. If so, the archive may have been managing incoming and outgoing goods, tracking volumes, origins, and allocations. Yet without deciphering Linear A, this remains hypothesis, and that is the central tension of Zakros. We can reconstruct the system, but not the information it processed. Linear A itself deepens the mystery. Unlike Linear B, which was later deciphered and found to encode an early form of Greek Linear A, has resisted all attempts at translation. Its symbols number in the hundreds, combining phonetic and logographic elements. Frequency analysis suggests structured language, possibly administrative in nature, but no bilingual inscriptions like the Rosetta Stone have ever been found to unlock it. This leaves researchers in a position rarely encountered in archaeology, observing a functioning data infrastructure without understanding its content. The final layer of the mystery emerges when considering collapse. Around 1450 BCE, Zakros, along with other Minoan centers, was destroyed likely as part of a broader regional upheaval involving earthquakes, volcanic activity, and possible Mycenaean expansion. The archive was never recovered, never reorganized, never rebuilt. It simply stopped. From a systems perspective, this is equivalent to a sudden shutdown with no backup. And yet, The physical remnants remain precise. Rooms retain their functions. Tablets remain grouped. Seals remain where they were last used. The system did not decay gradually, it was interrupted mid-operation. This creates a rare archaeological condition, a preserved failure state. When viewed through a modern lens, Zakros challenges a fundamental assumption that advanced information systems require advanced technology. Here, without metal data carriers, without digital encoding, without even a fully understood script, a Bronze Age society constructed a network of data management that exhibits principles recognizable today. Standardization, authentication, compartmentalization, and integration with logistics. The tools were simple, the system was not, and that is where the true mystery lies. Not in whether the Minoans possessed lost machines or unknown energies, but in whether they developed a level of organizational intelligence that we have consistently underestimated. Zakros does not suggest a forgotten technology in the conventional sense. It suggests something more subtle and perhaps more profound. That complexity does not always leave behind a language we can read. On the edge of the white travertine terraces of Pamukkale, inside the ruins of Hierapolis, there exists a structure that behaves less like architecture and more like a weapon, where animals led into a small stone opening collapse within seconds, birds flying too low fall mid-air, and yet just steps away, human figures once stood unharmed, calm, deliberate, even ritualistic. Ancient writers described it as a literal entrance to the underworld, a place where the god Pluto ruled from beneath the earth. But the real mystery is not that something died there, it is that someone, more than 2,000 years ago, understood exactly how to control it. The site was first described in detail by Strabo in the 1st century BCE, who reported that animals died instantly inside the cavern while temple priests appeared immune, and for centuries the account was dismissed as exaggeration or symbolic mythology, until modern excavations led by Francesco D'Andrea, beginning in 2011, rediscovered and scientifically analyzed the structure, revealing that the cave emits concentrated carbon dioxide gas, with levels reaching up to 80 to 90% CO2 near the ground, far beyond the threshold lethal to mammals. Considering that exposure to just 10% CO2 can cause unconsciousness within minutes, confirming that the so-called Gate of Hell was not myth but measurable reality, while simultaneously raising a deeper question about how such a phenomenon was understood and controlled in antiquity. Carbon dioxide is invisible, odorless, and heavier than air, and under stable conditions it forms a dense layer close to the ground, effectively creating an invisible lake of suffocating gas, with modern measurements at the site showing that this lethal layer can reach heights of approximately 40 to 60 centimeters, depending on temperature and atmospheric pressure, becoming most stable and most deadly at dawn and dusk, when thermal mixing is minimal, which explains why small animals die almost instantly, as their breathing zone is entirely within the CO2 layer, while humans standing upright may keep their heads above it. Yet this explanation introduces a deeper problem, because the phenomenon is not constant. It shifts hour by hour. Wind disperses it, sunlight destabilizes it, and seasonal variations alter its behavior. And despite this variability, ancient priests operating at the site appear to know exactly when and how to enter safely, conducting rituals at specific times of day, often early morning or evening, when gas stratification was strongest, positioning themselves at precise elevations and possibly holding their breath during brief exposures lasting only seconds, indicating not random survival but pattern recognition under lethal conditions, which would have required repeated experimentation where each error could be fatal, gradually refining knowledge into a functional system that included identifying safe height thresholds relative to gas accumulation, recognizing environmental cues such as still air and temperature gradients, and timing ritual performances to maximize visible effect while minimizing risk, a process that in modern terms resembles a primitive form of environmental gas modeling conducted without instruments, sensors, or formal theory. And when compared to modern industrial safety systems that rely on electronic CO2 detectors calibrated to parts per million precision, the achievement becomes even more striking because ancient operators relied solely on observation, memory, and survival, yet still achieved a level of predictive control over a deadly gas system that is functionally comparable. Excavations of the plutonium reveal architectural modifications that may have amplified the phenomenon, including an entrance corridor that narrows toward the gas-emitting fissure, reducing airflow and allowing carbon dioxide to accumulate more densely, along with stone barriers and elevated platforms that create a clear spatial separation between the lethal zone and the observer area, ensuring that spectators remain safe while maintaining direct visual access to the deadly effect. And although the geometry appears simple, it is highly effective, as modern fluid dynamics demonstrates that even minor changes in enclosure shape can significantly influence gas retention, with partially enclosed spaces capable of trapping heavier gases and preventing dispersion, leaving open the question of whether Roman builders fully understood these principles or arrived at them through iterative trial and error. Yet regardless of the method, the outcome is clear because the structure does not merely contain the gas, but actively stabilizes it, transforming a natural hazard into a controlled and repeatable phenomenon. Ancient sources describe ritual sacrifices in which animals were led into the cavern and died almost instantly, creating a powerful visual demonstration where life was extinguished without visible cause, while priests stood at the threshold, seemingly immune. And from a modern scientific perspective, this can be understood as a carefully staged interaction with a physical gradient in gas concentration, where below approximately 0.5 meter carbon dioxide reaches lethal levels, while above that threshold, the air remains survivable, producing a sharp transition between death and survival within a vertical distance of less than 1 meter, an effect that would have appeared supernatural to observers, but is in reality a boundary condition within a stratified gas system. Although the consistency with which this effect was reproduced suggests deliberate control rather than coincidence, implying that ancient practitioners were not merely performing rituals but engaging in a form of applied environmental manipulation that approaches engineering in both precision and repeatability. Hierapolis is not the only place on Earth where lethal gas accumulates, as volcanic and tectonic regions worldwide produce similar emissions, such as the catastrophic release of carbon dioxide at Lake Nyos in 1986, which suffocated more than 1,700 people, or the persistent gas emissions observed in volcanic zones across Italy and Iceland. Yet these events are typically unpredictable, large-scale, and destructive, whereas Hierapolis represents a rare case of a localized, stable, and continuously active gas source that was not only recognized but integrated into cultural and ritual practice, making it fundamentally different from other natural gas phenomena, because it demonstrates not just exposure but controlled interaction, a distinction that highlights the uniqueness of the site in both archaeological and scientific contexts. Despite modern scientific explanations, several critical uncertainties remain unresolved, including how long it took for ancient observers to identify safe exposure limits without instrumentation, whether unrecorded fatalities contributed to the development of this knowledge, whether priests transmitted empirical rules across generations, forming a concealed body of technical understanding, and to what extent architectural modifications were intentionally designed to optimize gas behavior rather than simply accommodate it. Leaving these questions open, not because the physics is unknown, but because the historical process through which such knowledge was acquired has left no direct record. What do you think this really represents? An early form of lost environmental engineering, or simply survival knowledge refined to its absolute limit? And how much of that knowledge might have disappeared with the civilizations that once controlled it? On a steep limestone ridge rising nearly 300 meters above the plains of western Anatolia, the ruins of Pergamon Acropolis still hold the fractured remains of one of the most ambitious constructions of the Hellenistic world, the Great Altar of Pergamon. Built in the 2nd century BCE, most likely during the reign of Eumenes II, this structure was not merely a religious monument but an engineered terrace carved directly into a mountain slope, an artificial platform capable of supporting tens of thousands of tons of stone while maintaining geometric precision that, even by modern standards, appears excessive. What makes Pergamon truly unsettling is not its scale, but the combination of geotechnical stability, millimeter-level alignment, and extreme sculptural depth, all achieved without any surviving documentation of the methods used. And when compared to other Hellenistic constructions such as the temples at Delphi or the terraces of Priene, Pergamon stands apart because those sites follow known architectural logic, while Pergamon seems to push beyond it into a level of precision and complexity that appears, at times, unnecessary. The altar does not sit on natural ground, but instead rests on a constructed terrace carved and expanded from a steep incline estimated at 25 to 30 degrees, meaning ancient engineers first had to remove massive quantities of bedrock and then replace them with a layered system of stone blocks and fill material arranged with deliberate precision. Archaeological analysis reveals multi-layered stone packing with interlocking blocks, smaller aggregate materials inserted between larger stones to absorb stress, and retaining walls rising several meters in height, forming a system that in modern civil engineering closely resembles gravity-retaining walls designed to counteract lateral soil pressure. Yet no textual record from the Hellenistic period describes such techniques in detail, and this absence becomes even more striking when considering Pergamon's seismic context in western Anatolia, an active tectonic zone where over more than 2,000 years the terrace has endured earthquakes, erosion, and human dismantling while still maintaining structural coherence. For comparison, Roman concrete structures such as those in Pompeii benefited from hydraulic cement and chemical binding, whereas Pergamon predates widespread Roman concrete usage and relies almost entirely on stone geometry and load distribution, raising a fundamental question of how engineers achieved long-term slope stability using only dry stone construction at such a scale. The altar itself forms a monumental U-shaped structure with a central staircase approximately 20 meters wide, a front facade spanning about 35 meters, and a total depth exceeding 30 meters. Proportions that are not unusual for monumental architecture, but whose precision is, as survey measurements of reconstructed plans indicate alignment deviations, often below a few millimeters across large spans. Tolerances comparable to finely cut ashlar masonry seen in later Roman imperial projects, and approaching the precision of classical Greek temples like the Parthenon, where optical corrections were deliberately applied, however. Pergamon introduces an additional layer of controlled visual manipulation, with the staircase and surrounding walls arranged to enhance perceived scale when viewed from below through what is now known as forced perspective, creating a technical contradiction, because achieving this effect requires maintaining strict geometric ratios, while simultaneously introducing subtle deviations to control visual perception, something extraordinarily difficult without advanced measuring tools, especially across a sloped terrace. And even more puzzling is the fact that such precision exceeds functional necessity, since a religious altar does not require millimeter accuracy to operate, yet Pergamon achieves it consistently. Encircling the altar is one of the most celebrated sculptural programs of antiquity, the Gigantomachy frieze, which stretches approximately 113 meters in length and rises to about 2.3 meters in height, while containing over 100 figures in high relief. And although at first glance it appears to be a masterpiece of Hellenistic art, closer inspection reveals a far more complex system, where the relief is not uniformly carved but instead varies dramatically in depth, from shallow incisions to cuts exceeding 20 centimeters, with surfaces angled to manipulate light and shadow dynamically, and anatomical details such as muscle tension, skin folds, and hair strands rendered with near scientific precision. From a technical standpoint, this presents serious challenges because marble is prone to fracture under deep carving, meaning removing large volumes of material without causing cracks requires precise control of force and direction. And when compared to later works such as Trajan's column, which maintain relatively shallow carving depths to preserve structural integrity, Pergamon does the opposite by pushing depth to extremes while maintaining cohesion, suggesting that the frieze may have functioned as more than decoration, since the varying depths and angles indicate an understanding of light modeling where surfaces are intentionally shaped to control how sunlight interacts with the sculpture throughout the day, implying awareness of solar angles, planning of relief depth based on viewing position, and integration of sculpture into architectural lighting design, which in modern terms resembles computational surface modeling where geometry is optimized for visual output under specific lighting conditions. Yet no grids, guidelines, or preparatory markings have been conclusively identified on surviving fragments, leaving open the question of whether the Gigantomachy was purely artistic or a carefully engineered surface designed to manipulate perception. If each element of Pergamon is examined individually, it can be explained, as retaining walls are known, symmetry is known, and sculpture is known. Yet Pergamon combines all of them at maximum complexity into a single structure, bringing together a massive engineered terrace on unstable terrain, a geometrically precise architectural layout, and a sculptural program pushing material limits. And none of these were strictly necessary, since other Hellenistic altars functioned with simpler designs, and religious practice did not demand extreme relief depth or millimeter alignment, while even large sanctuaries like Delphi or Olympia achieved cultural significance without such technical escalation, suggesting that Pergamon was not designed for efficiency, but instead to demonstrate control over material, space and perception. No surviving manuscript from Pergamon describes how this structure was built, no named engineer is credited, and no construction manual has been found. Yet the evidence embedded in the structure indicates an advanced understanding of load distribution, long-term slope stabilization techniques, precision stone cutting and alignment, and the integration of art with optical and environmental factors. And although later Roman engineering texts such as those by Vitruvius provide detailed explanations of construction methods, nothing comparable survives from Pergamon, making it possible that the knowledge was transmitted orally, lost over time, or represents a peak of technical experimentation that was never fully recorded. What do you think, just peak Hellenistic engineering, or something more advanced that history failed to record? Share your thoughts in the comments below. In the middle of Egypt's western desert, where annual rainfall is effectively zero and summer temperatures regularly exceed 50 degrees Celsius, Al-Khaga Oasis should not exist as a long-term human settlement. Yet, archaeological evidence shows continuous occupation spanning more than 2,000 years, and the mystery is not simply survival but stability, because beneath the sand lies an invisible infrastructure of underground water systems, desert fortifications built from fragile materials that refuse to decay, and a necropolis where painted surfaces remain preserved far beyond what environmental physics would predict, meaning Al-Khaga is not defined by what stands above ground, but by a network of technologies that operate quietly, precisely, and without clear documentation of how they were engineered, turning what should have been an uninhabitable void into a controlled and sustained human environment. Al-Khaga first entered modern scientific awareness during 19th century expeditions, mapping ancient trade routes linking the Nile Valley to sub-Saharan Africa, where early survey teams documented scattered ruins. But only in the 20th century did systematic excavation reveal that these were not isolated remnants, but parts of a coordinated system, as remote sensing, geological surveys, and field archaeology uncovered Qanat-style underground channels, Roman military installations, and the extensive Bagawat necropolis, transforming the oasis from a peripheral desert outpost into one of the clearest examples of long-term engineered adaptation to hyper-arid conditions, supported by layered occupation evidence, ceramic analysis, and radiocarbon dating that confirms sustained habitation across multiple historical periods. The survival of Al-Khaga depends on Qanat systems, underground tunnels designed to transport groundwater over long distances using gravity alone, and these channels often extend between 10 and 15 kilometers, with vertical shafts spaced at consistent intervals. Yet what makes them extraordinary is their gradient, because modern hydraulic engineering indicates that stable flow without erosion or stagnation requires slopes of roughly 1 to 2 meters per kilometer, and measurements taken in comparable North African and Middle Eastern systems show that Al-Khaga's channels fall within this range with deviations of only a few centimeters over hundreds of meters, implying a level of precision that suggests an advanced understanding of hydrostatic pressure, subsurface geology, and long-distance alignment without visible reference points, which becomes even more significant when compared to Persian Qanats of the 1st millennium BCE that demonstrate similar efficiency, meaning two geographically separated systems converged on nearly identical engineering solutions without shared documented theory, leaving a gap between observed capability and recorded knowledge that modern archaeology has yet to fully bridge. During the Roman period, Al-Khaga became part of a defensive and logistical chain protecting trans-desert trade routes, where fortresses such as Qasr al-Guaita and Dush were constructed primarily from mud brick, a material that under normal environmental stress should degrade rapidly when exposed to temperature fluctuations exceeding 30 degrees Celsius within a single day, continuous wind-driven sand abrasion, and minimal moisture cohesion. Yet many of these structures have persisted for over 1,500 years, and laboratory analysis of ancient mud brick samples across Egyptian desert sites suggests that their durability may be linked to high clay content combined with sand. Organic fibers such as straw acting as tensile reinforcement, and controlled drying processes that reduce internal cracking. But even when these variables are replicated experimentally, the resulting material does not consistently match the long-term durability observed in situ, indicating that either the extreme aridity of the Western Desert creates a preservation environment more stable than current models predict, or ancient builders developed optimized compositions and structural techniques that remain only partially understood. Among the most perplexing features of Al-Khaga is the Bagawat necropolis, a vast early Christian cemetery containing more than 260 domed tombs dating from approximately the 4th to 7th centuries CE, where inside several chapels, wall paintings depicting biblical scenes such as the Exodus remain visible with remarkable clarity. And from a conservation science perspective, pigment survival depends on chemical stability, interaction with oxygen and humidity, and the thermal expansion and contraction of the underlying plaster, yet desert environments typically accelerate degradation through daily heating and cooling cycles that generate microfractures, leading to flaking and pigment loss, while intense ultraviolet radiation further breaks down organic and inorganic color compounds, making the preservation at Bhagawat highly anomalous. Because pigments retain visible coloration after more than 15 centuries, structural domes remain intact despite being constructed from mud brick, and interior microclimates appear to reduce the rate of deterioration, which contrasts sharply with sites such as the Roman catacombs, where preservation is facilitated by stable humidity and minimal airflow, whereas Bhagawat exists in an exposed desert environment where such stability should not naturally occur, leading researchers to propose multiple overlapping explanations, including the use of mineral-based pigments such as iron oxides with high Makaomet to ultraviolet radiation, architectural dome designs that regulate internal temperature gradients and reduce thermal stress, and natural sealing effects created by accumulated dust layers that limit airflow and environmental exchange. Yet none of these hypotheses independently accounts for the degree of preservation observed, suggesting that Bhagawat represents a rare convergence of environmental conditions, material science, and architectural design that challenges existing models of long-term decay in extreme climates. The Temple of Hybis, constructed during the Persian period in the 6th century BCE, contains relief carvings with remarkable uniformity, where the incised lines maintain consistent depth and spacing across large stone surfaces, indicating controlled techniques and repeatable processes. And although experimental archaeology demonstrates that copper and early iron tools are capable of producing such carvings, they typically result in inconsistencies and require extensive labor investment, whereas the consistency observed at Hybis suggests highly trained artisans working within standardized systems, possibly employing guides, templates, or iterative carving methods that allowed for precision approaching proto-industrial production, raising questions about efficiency, labor organization, and the transmission of technical knowledge in the absence of written manuals or preserved toolkits that could fully explain how such consistency was achieved across an entire architectural complex. What do you think explains Bhagawat's preservation? A rare convergence of environmental factors, or evidence of techniques that have been lost to history? In the ruins of Aphrodisias in southwestern Turkey, there stands a structure that feels less like architecture and more like a controlled system. The Sebastion of Aphrodisias, built in the 1st century CE to honor the emperors of the Roman Empire, is not simply a ceremonial space. It is a corridor nearly 90 meters long, bordered by multi-story walls that once carried more than 80 large marble reliefs. These reliefs were not randomly placed. They were arranged in a strict visual sequence, guiding the observer through mythology, conquest, and imperial authority. The central mystery is not the imagery itself, but the precision behind it. How material, structure, and narrative appear engineered with a level of consistency that challenges what we assume about ancient technical capability. The Sebastion did not reveal itself as a complete monument. Its modern story began in fragments during the 20th century, when archaeologists, most notably Keenan T., Erim began systematic excavations in the 1960s. What they encountered was not an intact structure, but a field of scattered components, collapsed walls, reused marble blocks, and relief panels embedded into later constructions. At first, these fragments seemed disconnected, but as excavation seasons progressed, patterns began to emerge. Relief panels were identified not as isolated artworks, but as parts of a larger composition. By the 1980s, enough material had been catalogued to reconstruct significant portions of the facade. Archaeologists determined that the corridor had been flanked by two parallel walls, each rising in multiple tiers, with sculptural panels arranged in vertical registers. Each register carried a different category of imagery gods, heroes, emperors, and personified regions of the empire. This was not decoration. It was sequencing. The site gradually revealed itself as a dismantled narrative architecture, one that had been designed to deliver information in a controlled visual order. In this sense, the discovery was not just physical, but conceptual. The realization that the Sebastion functioned as a structured system rather than a static monument. Aphrodisias was famous in antiquity for its marble quarries, producing a fine-grained calcite stone with crystal sizes, often below 1 millimeter and relatively low impurity levels. Such material allows for high-detail carving, but the Sebastion pushes this advantage into a range that raises deeper technical questions. Detailed measurements of surviving reliefs show extremely controlled carving depths. In many panels, transitions between foreground figures and background surfaces occur within just a few millimeters, creating smooth gradients of shadow that resemble modern bas-relief techniques. Anatomical features, muscle tension, facial symmetry, even the layering of fabric are executed with remarkable consistency across multiple panels. Scientific analysis of symmetry indicates deviations, often within 1 to 2 millimeters across bilateral features of faces. For hand-carved stone, repeated at scale, this level of accuracy is difficult to explain without some form of guiding system. Roman sculptors are known to have used iron chisels, claw chisels, and abrasives such as emery, but these tools alone do not fully account for the uniformity observed. Microscopic studies of tool marks reveal another anomaly. Surface finishing appears to follow consistent, multi-stage processes. Certain areas are deliberately left matte, while others are polished to higher reflectivity. This suggests that artisans were not only carving forms but also engineering how light would interact with different textures. The result is a controlled visual effect, one that changes depending on viewing angle and illumination. When compared with other Roman achievements such as the structural precision of the Pantheon or the realism of imperial portrait sculpture, the Sebastion stands out for the density of fine detail per surface area. It is not simply well made, it is consistently precise. Several hypotheses attempt to explain this. One suggests the use of early pointing devices, mechanical systems, for transferring proportions from a model to stone. While these are documented in later periods, direct evidence for their use at this scale in the 1st century is scarce. Another theory proposes a highly organized workshop system, where different artisans specialized in stages such as rough cutting, detailing, and finishing, all guided by strict proportional templates. Yet even these explanations leave gaps. The consistency across dozens of panels, potentially produced over long periods, suggests not only skill but process control. The marble was not just carved, it was processed in a way that approaches repeatability, a concept closer to engineering than traditional craftsmanship. Beyond the material itself, the Sebastion reveals a second layer of precision: standardization in imagery. Figures across different panels share consistent proportions, similar poses, and recurring anatomical structures. Heads align with comparable ratios to body height. Limbs follow repeated geometric relationships, and stances are variations of a limited set of base forms. This suggests the use of templates or canonical models. Inscriptions and stylistic differences indicate that multiple sculptors work simultaneously, yet the final output remains cohesive. This implies centralized planning, a design system that ensured consistency across independent contributions. Such standardization was not unknown in the Roman Empire. It can be seen in coin production, military equipment, and architectural modules. However, applying it to narrative relief sculpture at this scale is unusual. Here, standardization is used not to simplify production, but to maintain a unified visual language across a complex ideological program. The result is a form of controlled variation. Each panel is unique, yet all belong to a single system. This balance between repetition and difference is a hallmark of structured design. The Sebastion is not only about what is carved, but how it is experienced. The corridor's proportions, long, narrow, and enclosed, create a directional flow that guides movement forward. Visitors would not wander randomly. They would be led through a controlled path. The vertical arrangement of reliefs adds another layer. Lower panels are easily visible, while upper tiers require the viewer to look upward, shifting attention across multiple levels. This creates a structured viewing sequence, forcing engagement with the imagery in a specific order. Lighting plays a critical role. Studies suggest that sunlight would have entered the corridor at particular angles throughout the day, selectively illuminating certain panels while leaving others in shadow. This dynamic interaction between light and relief enhances depth perception and emphasizes different parts of the narrative over time. Such coordination implies intentional design. While Roman architects understood orientation and illumination, the level of integration here suggests something more deliberate, an early form of perceptual engineering. The space does not simply contain images, it controls how those images are perceived. Do you think the Sebastion is simply the peak of ancient craftsmanship, or evidence of a technical system we still don't fully understand? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Along the Red Sea escarpment, on a wind-exposed plateau more than 2,600 meters above sea level, Quahito at first appears to be a modest cluster of ruins. But beneath that simplicity lies a contradiction. Here, in an environment defined by water scarcity, thermal stress, and erosion, ancient builders created a settlement that not only endured, but operated with a level of engineering logic comparable to far more advanced civilizations. The most unsettling mystery is not what was built, but how every part of the system seems to solve problems with an efficiency that should not have been possible with the tools and knowledge of its time. Although local populations had long known of the ruins, Quahito entered formal archaeological awareness in the early 20th century, during surveys of the Eritrean Highlands conducted under Italian colonial administration. Subsequent expeditions throughout the 20th century mapped the plateau, revealing an extensive network of terraces, reservoirs, temples, and domestic structures spread across several square kilometers. Artifacts recovered, including inscriptions in the South Arabian script and architectural parallels, linked the site to the Kingdom of Aksum, a major trading power between roughly the 1st and 7th centuries CE. Yet even with this cultural attribution, the technological coherence of Quahito remained unexplained. Excavations produced fragments of a civilization but not the blueprint behind it. The defining constraint of Quahito is water. The plateau lacks any permanent river, and modern rainfall averages between approximately 300 and 500 millimeters annually, highly seasonal and unreliable. Yet archaeological evidence indicates a settlement capable of supporting a substantial population. At the center of this paradox stands the Saphira Dam, an ancient structure designed to capture and store runoff from rare rain events. Combined with rock-cut cisterns and channel systems, the plateau forms an integrated hydraulic network. Estimates suggest that even a modest reservoir capacity of several thousand cubic meters could sustain hundreds, possibly thousands of inhabitants if managed efficiently. This implies not only construction capability, but hydrological foresight understanding runoff patterns, evaporation rates, and storage efficiency. Comparatively, Roman cistern systems such as those in North Africa relied on similar principles, but were typically supported by formalized surveying tools, standardized measurements, and written engineering traditions. At Cuajito, no such documentation has been found. The system exists, functions logically, yet lacks an identifiable knowledge framework. The architecture of Cuajito is dominated by dry stone masonry, carefully shaped blocks assembled without mortar. This technique is widespread in ancient construction, from Mediterranean terraces to Andean walls. However, the execution here introduces a critical anomaly. Stone blocks are fitted with remarkable precision, reducing voids and enhancing structural stability. In many locations, walls remain standing after nearly 2,000 years of exposure. The precision suggests controlled shaping, yet there is limited evidence of advanced metal tools typically associated with such work. From an engineering standpoint, such tight-fitting construction reduces internal stress distribution and increases resistance to lateral forces, including wind and minor seismic activity. But this raises a question of intent. In a resource-limited environment, why invest labor into achieving a level of precision beyond what is structurally necessary? This pattern echoes other ancient sites such as Inca stonework at Machu Picchu, where precision appears to exceed immediate functional requirements. In both cases, the construction implies a deeper understanding of material behavior than the archaeological record clearly supports. The most difficult mystery to reconcile is not structural design, but material survival. High-altitude plateau environments impose extreme stress on stone construction. Daily temperature fluctuations can exceed 20 degrees Celsius, producing cycles of thermal expansion and contraction. Over time, this leads to microfracturing, displacement, and eventual collapse, particularly in dry masonry systems lacking binding agents. Wind erosion further accelerates degradation, especially in exposed terrain such as Cuajito. Under such conditions, many ancient dry stone structures elsewhere show significant collapse within centuries. Yet at Cuajito, numerous walls and terraces remain partially intact after nearly 2 millennia. Stones show limited displacement. Structural lines remain coherent. In some cases, surface textures suggest deliberate shaping or finishing that may influence weather resistance. From a material science perspective, durability at this scale implies one or more of the following: careful selection of lithology, choosing stone types with low porosity and high Macaulmet to thermal stress. Optimization of block geometry, minimizing stress concentrations and improving load distribution. Possible surface treatment, whether through polishing, heat exposure, or other unknown methods that alter erosion rates. The absence of binding material makes this even more striking. Stability emerges purely from geometry, mass, and friction. When compared to other ancient sites exposed to similar climates such as dry stone settlements in the Levant or North Africa, Cuajito's preservation appears disproportionate. It does not simply survive. It persists beyond what environmental models would predict. Beyond individual structures, the plateau reveals signs of coordinated planning. Terraces are aligned to maximize land use and possibly control runoff. Pathways connect elevated and lower zones efficiently. Architectural clusters suggest zoning, domestic, ceremonial, and possibly administrative. Such organization implies a systemic approach to settlement design. Yet, unlike Roman or Mesopotamian contexts, there is no surviving body of written engineering instructions, measurement systems, or architectural treatises associated with the site. This absence creates a paradox. The physical evidence indicates planning, the historical record does not preserve the process. Haito is often interpreted as part of the broader Aksumite world, a civilization known for trade networks extending across the Red Sea and into the Mediterranean. However, even within that context, the plateau stands apart. Its solutions are highly localized, tailored to a specific environmental constraint. Its engineering is efficient, but not visibly derived from known traditions. And most importantly, its knowledge system, whatever produced it, has left almost no trace. There is no gradual progression visible in the archaeological layers that leads clearly to this level of integration. Instead, the system appears already functional, already optimized. So how did a system this coherent exist, without leaving behind the knowledge that made it possible? What do you think explains Haito's engineering, lost knowledge, overlooked science, or something else entirely? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Greek gymnasium stands in a place where Greek civilization was never supposed to survive. At the far eastern edge of the Hellenistic world, thousands of kilometers from Athens, a structure appears precise, symmetrical, intellectually designed, and culturally rigid, refusing to adapt to its environment, refusing to simplify, instead replicating a system in full, and that is where the mystery begins. The ruins of Ai-Khanoum were first systematically excavated in the 1960s by a French archaeological mission led by Paul Bernard, and located at the confluence of the Oxus River in ancient Bactria. The site revealed a fully developed Hellenistic city with theatres, palaces, and most unexpectedly a massive gymnasium, where inscriptions and architectural remains, including Greek philosophical maxims, confirmed not only cultural presence, but a deliberate intellectual transplantation across thousands of kilometers. The gymnasium measures approximately 100 by 100 meters, enclosing a central courtyard surrounded by colonnaded corridors, a scale comparable to major gymnasia in core Greek regions such as Delphi, and even parts of Alexandria during the Hellenistic period. Yet Ai-Khanoum itself was not a dense intellectual hub, with estimates based on its urban footprint suggesting a population likely under 10,000, meaning a structure of this magnitude would typically serve a significantly larger civic body, as in classical Greek cities, gymnasia were deeply integrated into political and philosophical life, often supporting hundreds of active participants simultaneously. But here the numbers do not align, because the architectural investment columns, plastered surfaces, training rooms, lecture spaces implies continuous high-volume use, while archaeological evidence instead indicates limited occupancy density, raising a critical question of whether the gymnasium was built for the population that existed or for a population that was expected but never fully materialized. The layout of the gymnasium follows strict geometric principles including axial symmetry, proportional spacing, and orthogonal alignment, where the central courtyard is framed by a peristyle colonnade and rooms are distributed along predictable modular intervals, and measurements taken during excavation indicate deviations of only a few centimeters across long structural spans, a level of precision expected in regions where Greek surveying traditions were well established, through techniques later formalized in works associated with Euclid. Yet Ai-Khanoum presents a contradiction because the site lies in a seismically and geologically variable region, where soil composition near the Oxus River consists of layered sediments prone to shifting, while local Central Asian constructions of the same era often show misalignments of several degrees due to terrain adaptation and less rigid planning systems. But the gymnasium resists this pattern entirely, as its geometry is not adaptive but imposed, suggesting that maintaining such alignment would require not only precise measurement tools, but also a controlled construction process capable of compensating for environmental irregularities. And although no direct evidence of advanced surveying instruments has been recovered at the site, the final architectural outcome implies a level of planning discipline that exceeds what the local context alone can reasonably explain. The most technically perplexing aspect of the gymnasium lies in its materials, because the primary construction medium is mud brick, an earthen composite typically made from clay, water, and organic timber such as straw, which under standard conditions is highly vulnerable to environmental degradation, especially in arid climates with strong wind exposure, where erosion rates can significantly weaken adobe structures within centuries if left unmaintained. And yet, at Ai-Khanum, structural remains have persisted for over 2,000 years, with field reports indicating that some wall sections retain clear stratification and edge definition that allow archaeologists to reconstruct building plans with high accuracy, while compressive strength estimates derived from surviving fragments suggest unusually consistent density across brick layers, implying controlled production rather than variable ad hoc fabrication. And when compared with broader archaeological data, the anomaly becomes more pronounced, as adobe constructions in Mesopotamia often require periodic rebuilding within 1 to 3 centuries, and unmaintained mud brick settlements across Central Asia typically lose structural clarity within several hundred years, whereas at Ai-Khanum identifiable architectural outlines remain after more than 2 millennia of exposure, leading to several competing hypotheses, including the possibility that the ratio of clay to temper was optimized beyond typical local practices with mineral inclusions from Oxus alluvial deposits, enhancing cohesion and resistance to microfracturing, or that layering techniques involving uniform brick dimensions and tightly controlled bonding patterns reduced internal stress points and improved load distribution over long periods, or that surface treatments such as plaster coatings acted as protective barriers against wind erosion and thermal expansion. Yet no single explanation fully accounts for the observed durability. And the core issue is not that the materials themselves were technologically advanced, but that their performance exceeds expectations relative to both composition and environment, indicating an underlying construction logic that appears disproportionately refined for its geographical and cultural context. The Greek gymnasium was never simply a physical training facility, but rather an institutional core where education, philosophy, and civic identity were shaped. And inscriptions found at Ai-Khanum, including moral and philosophical teachings, reflect traditions deeply rooted in classical Greek intellectual life, suggesting intentional cultural replication at a scale that raises deeper questions. Because constructing such a system in a distant and culturally distinct region implies not only a desire to preserve identity, but potentially an effort to project it, leading to 2 primary interpretations in which the gymnasium either functioned as a tool of cultural persistence, allowing Greek settlers to maintain continuity in a foreign environment, or as a strategic forward node of Hellenistic influence designed to extend and stabilize a broader cultural network. And in both interpretations, the structure transcends its physical role and becomes a mechanism for shaping human behavior, education, and identity across space. Do you think this structure served a practical need, or was it a deliberately constructed replica of civilization? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Perched atop a flat-topped sandstone plateau in northern Ethiopia, the Debre Damo monastery rises more than 15 meters above sheer vertical cliffs, cut off from the surrounding world in a way that seems almost deliberate. The only way up is by a leather rope lowered from above, a method that has remained unchanged for centuries and still defines access to the site today. According to historical tradition, The monastery was established in the 6th century CE by Abuna Aragawi, one of the 9 saints credited with spreading Christianity across the region. By the 19th century, European explorers and missionaries had already documented the same astonishing detail: a single rope, hauled by monks, functioning as the only entry point to a fully developed religious complex. From the very beginning, Debre Damo presents a contradiction. Religious centers are typically designed to gather communities, to be seen, to be reached. This one was built to resist access to exist apart from it. And yet, for nearly 1,500 years, it has not only survived, but remained continuously inhabited. What makes Debre Damo truly mysterious is not just its isolation, but the unanswered question at its core. How is a permanent, complex structure constructed on a plateau that appears, even today, almost impossible to reach? Unlike pilgrimage centers such as Machu Picchu or fortified heights like Sigiriya, which incorporate engineered pathways, terraces, or carved staircases, Debre Damo offers no such accommodations. The vertical cliff surrounding the plateau is approximately 15 to 25 meters high, composed of weathered sandstone with minimal natural footholds. The rope ascent still used today requires upper body strength, coordination, and assistance from above. This raises a structural paradox. Archaeological patterns show that ancient builders typically optimized accessibility during construction phases, even if later restricted. At Debre Damo, however, there is no evidence of a former staircase, ramp, or carved access route that was later removed or destroyed. Geological surveys of similar sandstone escarpments indicate erosion rates on the order of fractions of a millimeter per year. Even over 1,000 years, such erosion would not fully erase a large-scale carved staircase without leaving detectable remnants. Yet none have been conclusively identified. The implication is unsettling. Either the builders constructed the site under conditions vastly different from today, or they employed temporary systems that left virtually no trace. The most persistent mystery surrounding Debre Damo lies in what might be called the plateau construction problem. The monastery complex includes stone walls, timber beams, roofing materials, and interior structures consistent with early Aksumite civilization architectural techniques. Some wooden beams, particularly the distinctive monkey head projections, are integral load-bearing elements. To construct even a modest building, several tons of material would have been required. Timber beams alone could weigh hundreds of kilograms each. Stone blocks, depending on size and density, would add significantly more. In other ancient sites, the logistics of vertical transport are well documented. At Machu Picchu, laborers used inclined ramps and switchback trails. At Sigiriya, engineers carved stairways directly into the rock face. Even in extreme environments, such as cliff dwellings in the American Southwest, access routes, however narrow, were always present. At Debre Damo, none of these solutions appear to exist. One hypothesis suggests the use of rope and pulley systems. However, for such systems to lift heavy loads consistently, they typically require stable anchor points, scaffolding, or mechanical advantage devices such as compound pulleys. There is no surviving evidence of such infrastructure on the plateau edges or below. Another theory proposes that construction occurred gradually, with materials lifted in smaller increments. While plausible, this introduces further complications. Repeated lifting of heavy materials over a vertical drop of 15 to 20 meters would require a coordinated labor force and durable rope technology. Experimental archaeology offers some insight. Tests with leather ropes and simple pulley systems suggest that lifting loads exceeding 100 kilograms vertically becomes increasingly difficult without advanced mechanical advantage. Yet the scale of construction at Debre Damo implies cumulative loads far beyond that threshold. A third possibility is that temporary wooden scaffolding or earthen ramps once existed and were later removed or eroded. However, sediment analysis around the base of the plateau has not revealed clear evidence of large-scale artificial ramp structures. The result is a logistical gap. There is no fully satisfactory explanation for how the necessary construction materials reached the plateau in the first place. Despite these uncertainties, the monastery has endured for over 14 centuries. The architectural style reflects Aksumite construction methods, characterized by alternating layers of stone and timber. This hybrid approach distributes stress and allows flexibility under environmental pressure. The projecting wooden beams often visible on exterior walls serve both structural and aesthetic functions. From an engineering perspective, such designs can enhance resilience. Modern studies of similar composite systems show improved resistance to cracking and seismic stress compared to rigid stone-only construction. However, Debre Damo's environment presents additional challenges. Elevated plateaus experience stronger wind exposure, temperature fluctuations, and accelerated weathering. Wood, in particular, is vulnerable to decay, insects, and moisture. Yet some original structural elements have survived for centuries, suggesting either exceptional material selection or maintenance practices that are not fully documented. Comparatively, many ancient structures built at ground level have suffered greater degradation. This raises another question. Did the isolation of the plateau, rather than hindering preservation, actually protect the site from human interference and environmental damage? Debre Damo is not merely a construction puzzle. It is a sustained human environment. The plateau spans a limited area, yet it has supported a monastic community for generations. Food, water, and supplies must be transported upward, while agricultural activity on the plateau itself is constrained. Anthropological comparisons with other isolated communities such as monastic settlements on Mount Athos in Greece reveal similarities in social structure but significant differences in physical accessibility. Mount Athos, while restricted, remains reachable by land and sea. Debre Damo does not. This level of isolation suggests intentional design. The monastery functions as a controlled environment, limiting external contact and preserving religious traditions with minimal disruption. From a systems perspective, it resembles a self-regulating enclave where constraints reinforce continuity, but it also amplifies the original mystery. Juzo and Comte A. Few, why invest such effort to create a site that is inherently difficult to sustain? The founding legend of Abuna Aragawi describes his ascent aided by a giant serpent, a narrative that transforms an impossible climb into a divine act. While clearly symbolic, such stories often encode real challenges in mythological form. Across cultures, extraordinary engineering feats are frequently attributed to supernatural assistance, when the underlying techniques are not understood or have been forgotten. In this sense, the legend may not explain the construction of Debre Damo, but it acknowledges its improbability. So, what do you think? Was this built using lost engineering methods, or are we still missing a crucial piece of the story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. High in the Lake Titicaca basin of western Bolivia, near the core territory of the Tiwanaku civilization, lies a settlement that should not exist in the form we see it today. Lucaramata does not overwhelm with monumental gates or towering stone icons. Instead, it unsettles for a different reason, because it looks incomplete yet strangely intentional, as if frozen mid-thought. Archaeological surveys indicate continuous occupation from roughly 1500 BCE to 1000 CE, spanning nearly 2.5 millennia, a duration that places Lucumata among the longest continuously inhabited sites in the Andean Highlands. But what truly sets it apart is that many structural patterns, agricultural systems, and spatial organizations seen here appear before they are fully realized at Tiwanaku itself, suggesting a developmental sequence that runs counter to expectations. This raises a rarely asked question in archaeology. What if Lucumata was not a peripheral settlement, but a prototype, a place where systems were tested, refined, and sometimes abandoned long before they shaped one of the most influential civilizations in pre-Columbian South America? Unlike many ancient cities that vanish beneath jungle or desert, Lucumata was never truly lost, as its remains persisted in the landscape and blended into agricultural zones surrounding Lake Titicaca, quietly existing without dramatic rediscovery. Systematic archaeological investigation began in the mid-20th century, with major work during the 1970s and 1980s led by researchers such as Alan Colata, who revealed that Lucumata was not a single-phase settlement but a layered record of transformation, where architecture evolved gradually, agricultural systems expanded and contracted, and social organizations shifted across centuries. Unlike Tiwanaku, which presents a relatively unified urban vision with standardized monumental planning, Lucumata reads more like a timeline of experimentation, a site where ideas were continuously tested rather than finalized, offering archaeologists a rare longitudinal view into how a complex society may have developed its systems over time. Excavations show that Lucumata developed gradually without the sudden architectural standardization observed at Tiwanaku between roughly 500 and 800 CE, and instead its construction phases reveal variation, where different building techniques coexist, some refined while others appear abandoned mid-process, suggesting an iterative approach rather than a finalized plan. In Tiwanaku, stone blocks are often precisely cut and fitted with minimal mortar, reflecting a mature engineering tradition, whereas at Lucumata, archaeologists encounter walls with inconsistent alignment, foundations indicating redesign during construction, and transitions between crude and advanced masonry within the same structural contexts, patterns that are difficult to interpret as simple inefficiency. Comparable developmental layering has been observed at sites such as Çatalhöyük, where architecture reflects social adaptation over time, yet Lucumata differs in both scale and duration, persisting for centuries under increasingly complex environmental and social conditions, implying that what appears incomplete may actually represent a phase of continuous experimentation. This leads to an unsettling implication that Lucumata may not be a less advanced site at all, but rather a place where advancement itself was being defined through repeated trial, error, and refinement. Surrounding Lucumata lies one of the most sophisticated ancient agricultural systems ever documented, the raised field system known locally as Waru Waru, which operates in an environment that by conventional standards should be agriculturally unstable. Given that the altitude exceeds 3,800 meters above sea level, nighttime temperatures frequently fall below freezing, frost events occur unpredictably, and soil fertility is naturally limited without intervention. Despite these constraints, the system achieves remarkable efficiency by constructing elevated planting platforms separated by water-filled canals, where solar radiation heats the water during the day, and that stored heat is slowly released at night, creating a localized thermal buffer that can raise surrounding air temperatures by approximately 1 to 2 degrees Celsius, a seemingly small margin that is nevertheless sufficient to prevent frost damage to crops. Modern experimental reconstructions in the Lake Titicaca Basin during the 1980s demonstrated that such systems could produce yields 2 to 3 times higher than conventional high-altitude farming under comparable conditions, indicating that this was not an accidental adaptation, but a form of engineered microclimate control. The implications are profound because implementing such a system requires an implicit understanding of thermal inertia, heat exchange, hydrology, and long-term climatic observation, yet the Tiwanaku culture left no written language describing these processes. When compared to irrigation systems in Mesopotamia, which relied primarily on river flooding cycles and canal distribution, or even Roman agricultural engineering, which emphasized water transport rather than microclimate manipulation, the Lukurmata system appears conceptually closer to modern agroengineering practices than to its ancient counterparts. This raises a difficult question regarding the nature of knowledge transmission in such societies, because while one hypothesis suggests gradual accumulation of empirical knowledge across generations, and another proposes distributed knowledge systems embedded within communal practice, neither fully accounts for the precision and scalability observed across the landscape, leaving open the possibility that the knowledge was more systematic than currently assumed, but encoded in forms that have not survived or are not yet recognized by modern archaeology. Large-scale agricultural systems typically imply centralized authority structures capable of organizing labor, managing resources, and enforcing coordination, a pattern evident in civilizations ranging from Mesopotamia to ancient Egypt, yet Lukurmata does not conform to this expectation, as there is no clear evidence of monumental palaces, elite tombs filled with wealth, or dominant religious complexes exerting visible control over the landscape. Instead, the archaeological record suggests a relatively uniform distribution of structures, pointing toward a more decentralized or possibly egalitarian social organization, which directly challenges a foundational assumption in archaeology that complexity must be accompanied by visible hierarchy. This contradiction raises the possibility that Lukurmata operated under a different model of social organization, perhaps one in which knowledge systems rather than political authority structured society, or alternatively that the markers of hierarchy were constructed from perishable materials that have not survived, or encoded in symbolic systems that remain undeciphered. In either case, the absence of visible power structures does not indicate simplicity, but rather a form of complexity that does not align with traditional models. By around 1000 CE, both Lukurmata and the broader Tiwanaku system entered a period of decline, and paleoclimate data derived from ice cores and lake sediment analysis indicate a prolonged drought between approximately 900 and 1100 CE, which would have reduced water availability and placed stress on agricultural production. Yet this explanation remains incomplete because raised field agriculture is inherently resilient, designed to buffer frost, regulate moisture, and stabilize yields even under fluctuating environmental conditions. If any agricultural system should have endured climatic stress, it would have been this one, and yet it was ultimately abandoned, with no widespread evidence of warfare, no clear destruction layers, and no signs of sudden catastrophe, only a gradual cessation of activity. This pattern suggests a more complex collapse mechanism, possibly involving the breakdown of social coordination, the loss of specialized knowledge required to maintain the system, or a threshold effect in which environmental stress accumulates until even resilient systems fail abruptly. In modern systems theory, such a process is described as nonlinear collapse, where stability persists for long periods before giving way to rapid failure, and Lukurmata may represent one of the earliest empirical examples of such dynamics in human history. What do you think? Was Lukurmata a deliberate testing ground for one of South America's greatest civilizations? Or are we projecting modern concepts of experimentation onto a past that operated under entirely different principles? In the lowland forests of eastern Guatemala, along the fertile banks of the Motagua River, stands Quiriguá, a site that, at first glance, appears quiet, almost modest compared to towering Maya cities like Tikal or Copan. Yet that impression collapses the moment its monuments come into view, because rising from the earth here are the tallest freestanding stone monuments ever created in the Maya world, with the most extreme example, Stela E reaching over 10.6 meters in height and weighing approximately 60 to 65 metric tons, a scale that is not merely large but structurally improbable within the technological limits of its time, where no iron tools existed, no wheeled transport systems were in use, and no draft animals were capable of hauling such weight. And yet beyond this overwhelming scale lies a deeper anomaly, as every surface of these massive stones is covered in carvings of astonishing precision glyphs, portraits, ceremonial regalia executed with a level of detail that seems fundamentally incompatible with the tools presumed to exist, turning Quiriguá into something far more unsettling than a ceremonial center, because it is not simply a display of monumental ambition, but a contradiction carved directly into stone. Among all the mysteries at Quiriguá, one stands out with particular intensity: the precision of its carvings, because these are not rough symbolic engravings, but deeply incised, geometrically controlled compositions that remain consistent across entire monument faces, where each stela functions as a vertical historical document recording calendrical dates through the Maya long count system, along with royal genealogies and mythological references tied to rulers such as Kak Tiliwu Chan Yopat, who governed during the 8th century and commissioned many of the largest monuments following Quiriguá's political victory over Copan in the year 738. Yet the technical question remains unresolved, because the stelae are carved primarily from red sandstone, a material that typically falls between 6 and 7 on the Mohs hardness scale depending on composition, making it resistant enough to maintain structural integrity but brittle enough to fracture under uneven stress. While the tools available to Maya artisans are believed to have included obsidian blades with hardness around 5 to 5.5, extremely sharp yet fragile, jadeite or greenstone tools ranging from 6.5 to 7 in hardness, and hammerstones made of harder rock, which initially appears plausible until experimental archaeology introduces complications, as attempts to replicate even small glyph carvings using these materials consistently produce irregular groove depths, microchipping along edges, and progressive loss of fine detail under repeated strikes. Whereas the carvings at Quiriguá display consistent line depth, smooth internal surfaces, and minimal edge fracturing even in intricate glyph clusters only a few centimeters wide, suggesting either the existence of an unknown abrasion and polishing technique or a far more advanced and systematic workflow than simple percussion carving models can account for. And this becomes even more problematic when examining depth control, because unlike flat inscriptions at many other Maya sites, Quiriguá's stelae employ high-relief carving in which figures emerge from the stone in layered depth, with faces, headdresses, jewelry, and textiles rendered in complex overlapping planes that require precise spatial planning before carving begins, a method for measuring relative depth without modern instruments, and a controlled material removal process that avoids catastrophic fracture. Processes which in modern stoneworking would involve calipers, graduated chisels, and staged reduction techniques, none of which have been definitively identified in the archaeological record at Quiriguá, while the symmetry of human faces and body proportions further intensifies the problem, as deviations are minimal to the point that they imply either the use of pre-drawn templates applied directly onto stone surfaces or a level of spatial cognition that exceeds expectations for manual freehand carving. And when time investment is considered, the contradiction deepens, because carving a monument such as Stela E based on modern replication estimates could require thousands of labor hours, Yet Quirigua's peak period of monument production lasted only a few decades, during which multiple large stelae and zoomorphic sculptures were completed with comparable precision, forcing a logistical dilemma in which either the workforce was far larger and more specialized than current models suggest, or the carving process itself was significantly more efficient than experimental archaeology has been able to reproduce, neither of which is strongly supported by existing evidence. And when compared to other sites, the uniqueness of Quirigua becomes even more pronounced, because at Copan carvings are refined but generally smaller in scale. At Palenque relief work is elegant but less deeply incised, and at Tikal monumental emphasis shifts toward architecture rather than sculptural detail. While outside Mesoamerica, Egyptian reliefs at Karnak demonstrate precision, supported by copper and later bronze tools, and Mesopotamian carvings often sacrifice depth for surface clarity, whereas Quirigua alone achieves maximum scale and maximum detail simultaneously without evidence of metal tool dependence, creating a technical profile that does not align cleanly with any known ancient stoneworking tradition. Beyond the carvings themselves, the spatial arrangement of the stelae introduces another layer of mystery, because the monuments are not randomly placed but instead form a structured layout within the plaza, where alignments appear to correspond to solar events such as solstices and equinoxes, and certain sightlines between stelae may mark calendrical transitions, while others seem to encode political narratives, effectively transforming the plaza into a three-dimensional historical text. Yet as with the carving techniques, there is no surviving blueprint and no written manual explaining the system, leaving only the physical arrangement as evidence of an underlying logic that has not been fully reconstructed. Quirigua forces a confrontation with a deeper issue in archaeology, which is the gap between what is preserved and what is understood, because we can observe the results in the form of massive stones, precise carvings, and structured layouts, and we can attempt to reconstruct possible methods involving stone tools, organized labor, and astronomical observation. But between these layers lies a missing component: the exact processes, techniques, and knowledge systems that made such outcomes possible. And this absence is not trivial, as it represents an entire technological language that has been lost. And nowhere is that loss more visible than in the carvings themselves, where lines cut into stone display a level of control and confidence that should not exist under the limitations typically assigned to the ancient world. So what do you think really made this level of precision possible, and are we underestimating ancient technology? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. Banawali sits on the dry bed of the ancient Gaga River in present-day Haryana, a region once connected to the broader urban network of the Indus Valley civilization. Unlike the better-known sites of Mohenjo-Daro or Harappa, Banawali did not reveal itself through monumental ruins, but emerged slowly, layer by layer, through systematic excavation, and in the early 1970s, under the direction of Ravindra Singh Bisht, archaeologists began uncovering a settlement that immediately defied expectation, where the earliest excavation layers revealed a pre-Harappan village with circular and semi-rectilinear houses, handmade pottery, and an organic, almost unplanned layout that initially appeared typical. Yet the real anomaly surfaced in the second phase, when above this early layer, archaeologists uncovered a fully developed Harappan town built with standardized baked bricks following the classic 1:4 ratio, aligned streets, and a structured urban grid, clearly demonstrating integration into the wider Indus system. But unlike other sites, this transformation did not erase the past and instead preserved it. And at the center of this preserved structure lay what would later be called the inner fort. The excavation of Banawali unfolded in distinct stages, each revealing something that complicated the narrative rather than clarifying it. Beginning with the first excavation phase in the early 1970s, when archaeologists identified a dual settlement pattern consisting of a pre-Harappan base and a mature Harappan overlay, with pottery assemblages showing a clear technological transition from coarse handmade ceramics to finely crafted red ware decorated with black painted motifs, while radiocarbon estimates placed the earliest occupation around 3000 BCE, aligning with early regional development phases. And in the second excavation phase, attention shifted to structural remains, where the so-called inner fort began to take shape as an enclosed zone defined by massive mud brick walls measuring up to 3 to 4 meters thick. Yet despite this imposing construction, no clear defensive features appeared, with no bastions, no guard towers, and no weapon deposits. And instead, archaeologists found residential structures within the enclosure, including multi-room houses, storage areas, and evidence of domestic activity that blurred the boundary between a fortification and a living environment, while, in the third excavation phase, further trenching revealed something more subtle, yet far more puzzling in the form of inconsistent artifact distribution, where certain zones inside the enclosure were rich in pottery, tools and beads, while others were conspicuously empty with clean surfaces and minimal cultural debris, a pattern that could not be explained by erosion and instead suggested intentional spatial organization, reinforcing the idea that these distributions reflected deliberate human behavior rather than random loss. The defining feature of the inner fort is its walls, thick, continuous, and carefully constructed yet functionally ambiguous. And when compared to the citadel at Mohenjo-Daro, which rises on a massive platform clearly separated from the lower town and includes monumental structures such as the Great Bath, indicating administrative or ritual authority, or to Harappa, where fortified sectors include gateways and controlled access points, suggesting defensive or regulatory functions, Banawali presents a striking contrast because its enclosure is not significantly elevated, its entrances are not strongly reinforced, and there is no evidence of militarization, meaning that if this was a defensive structure, it was built without the logic of defense, leading to competing hypotheses such as flood control, given the unstable Gaga River system where thick walls could have acted as barriers. Yet sediment analysis does not support repeated catastrophic flooding on the scale required, or social separation implying a controlled zone for elites or administrators. Yet the absence of luxury artifacts such as gold, seals, or elaborate ornaments undermines this interpretation, leaving behind a structure defined more by what it lacks than by what it contains. The Indus Valley civilization is widely recognized as one of the most standardized urban systems in the ancient world, with cities laid out in precise grids, bricks following uniform ratios, and drainage systems consistent across vast distances. Yet Banawali disrupts this pattern through the layout of its inner fort, which is slightly curved and deviates from strict orthogonal planning, with some streets aligning with the Harappan grid while others follow earlier pre-Harappan orientations, suggesting a deliberate compromise where instead of imposing a completely new system, the builders adapted to an existing spatial framework, raising a critical contradiction as to why a civilization known for strict standardization would tolerate irregularity at such a central location. And comparative analysis with sites like Kalibangan shows clearer transitions where older layers were replaced by ordered construction, while Banawali uniquely preserves the past within the present, indicating that this deviation was not a failure of planning but a conscious decision. Perhaps the most unsettling discovery came not from what archaeologists found, but from what they did not, as inside the inner fort certain sectors exhibit extremely low artifact density with no pottery shards, no domestic waste, and no signs of prolonged habitation, which contrasts sharply with most ancient settlements where central zones accumulate debris over time, such as broken tools, discarded ceramics, and organic residue. And the absence of such materials at Banawali suggests that these areas were either regularly cleaned, indicating controlled use, restricted limiting access and activity, or dedicated to functions that leave minimal material traces, such as ritual or administrative processes. And although similar clean zones have been identified in ritual contexts in other cultures, Banawali lacks the architectural markers typically associated with temples or ceremonial complexes. With no altars, no iconography, and no inscriptions, leaving only deliberately empty space that appears to have been maintained with intention. Taken together, the evidence points toward a single conclusion: that the inner fort was not built for defense but for control. Yet the question remains, control of what? As one emerging theory proposes that Banawali functioned as a regional administrative node, regulating trade or production along the Gaga corridor, where the controlled enclosure may have served as a checkpoint or redistribution center. Yet this interpretation is weakened by the lack of large storage facilities, clear granaries, or a high concentration of trade goods, while another theory suggests a ritualized civic space where social or cultural processes occurred under strict regulation, which could explain the controlled access, the absence of debris, and the preservation of earlier spatial layouts potentially tied to sacred geography. But without inscriptions, one of the defining limitations in the study of the Indus civilization, these interpretations remain speculative. Banawali forces a reconsideration of how we interpret the Indus archaeology, as for decades the civilization has been viewed as highly standardized, centrally organized, and functionally efficient. Yet the inner fort introduces variability that is not random but structured, suggesting that local context, cultural memory, or unknown functional requirements could override broader urban norms, revealing that beneath the apparent uniformity of the Indus system there existed layers of decision-making that remain inaccessible to modern understanding. And perhaps more importantly, it highlights that absence of evidence should not be mistaken for absence of complexity. If a civilization as precise as the Indus could construct something this ambiguous at its core, what else might we have fundamentally misunderstood about the ancient world? An ancient urban centre sits near the former course of the Yamuna River in present-day Uttar Pradesh, its significance only becoming clear as layers of soil were gradually removed rather than through any single moment of discovery. As 19th century scholars began connecting descriptions from Buddhist and Jain texts to this location, eventually leading to systematic excavations in the mid-20th century under archaeologists such as G.R. Sharma, whose findings quickly challenged expectations of what an early historic Indian city should look like. The earliest excavation phases in the 1950s exposed massive defensive ramparts constructed of mud brick and compacted earth, with some sections measuring up to 30 meters thick, immediately placing Kaushambi outside the norm when compared to cities like Taxila, where fortifications rarely approach such scale, while subsequent trenching revealed stratigraphic layers indicating continuous occupation from around the 6th century BCE to at least the 5th century CE, suggesting nearly a millennium of urban continuity. Yet instead of a clear developmental trajectory, the layers showed repeated cycles of rebuilding, burning, and restructuring. The discovery of a fragmentary pillar attributed to Ashoka confirmed Kaushambi's importance during the Mauryan period, but its incomplete inscription and uncertain placement raised questions about whether it had been relocated, intentionally damaged, or never finished, and excavations of the Gosaterama monastery, associated in texts with Gautama Buddha, revealed a highly organized architectural plan with uniform cells arranged around a central courtyard. suggesting a level of planning rarely documented for structures of this period, while later excavation campaigns identified widespread burn layers across multiple occupational phases, indicating that destruction by fire was not a singular event but a recurring pattern, leaving each layer to add more data without ever providing a complete explanation. The fortifications of Kaushambi remain one of its most perplexing features, as a wall thickness approaching 30 meters implies either extraordinary defensive needs or a function beyond conventional warfare. For context, Achaemenid and early Persian fortifications rarely exceeded 10 meters in thickness, and even heavily fortified cities such as Jericho emphasized height and tactical positioning rather than sheer mass. Yet Kaushambi invested immense labor into horizontal density without leaving corresponding evidence of large-scale sieges, mass graves, or concentrations of weaponry. One hypothesis suggests that the walls served as flood control due to the proximity of the Yamuna River, but their layered structure and defensive geometry do not fully support a purely hydraulic interpretation, while another possibility is that they functioned as instruments of internal control rather than external defense, implying a level of socio-political organization that remains poorly understood, ultimately raising a deeper and unresolved question of why a city would invest in fortress-level construction without evidence of sustained external threat. Perhaps even more puzzling is the repeated evidence of burning across the site, as multiple stratigraphic levels reveal carbonized debris, heat-altered bricks exposed to temperatures estimated between 600 and 800 degrees Celsius, and structural collapses followed by reconstruction phases, forming a pattern of cyclical destruction that is unusual in the absence of warfare indicators. While similar burn layers have been observed at sites like Mohenjo-Daro or Pompeii, those cases are often tied to catastrophic events such as environmental disasters or sudden destruction, whereas Kaushambi lacks any single dominant signature, instead suggesting repeated episodes of fire over centuries. Possible explanations include accidental urban fires in densely built environments, industrial activities such as kilns or metallurgy, or large-scale ritual burning practices, yet none of these fully account for the consistency and recurrence observed in the archaeological record, leaving unresolved the question of why Kaushambi repeatedly burned, rebuilt, and burned again without a clear and identifiable trigger. The Gositarama monastery introduces a different kind of anomaly, as textual sources describe it as a religious site linked to Gautama Buddha, yet its architectural features suggest something far more structured and systematic than expected. Excavations reveal a grid-like arrangement of monastic cells with uniform dimensions, indicating standardized construction modules, along with a centralized courtyard designed to optimize movement and visibility, implying a level of pre-planned design that contrasts with the more organic development observed in many early Buddhist monastic sites. This suggests that the layout of Gositarama was conceived as a complete system from the outset, rather than evolving incrementally, raising the possibility that it functioned not only as a spiritual retreat, but also as a large-scale training center, an administrative hub, or even a controlled community with regulated spatial organization, with its architectural precision pointing toward institutional planning rather than purely religious expression. Despite centuries of occupation, Kaushambi does not exhibit a clear collapse event, as there is no definitive destruction horizon, no abrupt abandonment layer, and no physical evidence indicating mass migration, suggesting instead a gradual decline in which the city slowly lost its urban intensity over time. Environmental factors are often proposed, particularly the shifting course of the Yamuna River, which could have altered trade networks, water availability, and agricultural conditions, yet geological studies do not point to a single catastrophic event capable of explaining the city's decline. When compared to sites such as Angkor, where hydraulic failure contributed significantly to collapse, or Teotihuacan, Where evidence of internal unrest and destruction is visible, Kaushambi does not fit neatly into any known model, instead presenting a prolonged and ambiguous process of urban disengagement that lacks a clear causal mechanism. Kaushambi is not defined by a single mystery, but by a convergence of unresolved patterns, including fortifications built beyond apparent necessity, recurring fires without identifiable causes, architectural systems that suggest advanced planning, and a decline that resists singular explanation, with each element individually open to interpretation, yet collectively forming a structure of uncertainty that challenges conventional models of ancient urban development and collapse. This is what makes Kaushambi distinct, as it does not confront us with impossibility but with inconsistency, forcing a reconsideration of how ancient cities functioned, adapted, and ultimately disappeared from history. If a city can rise, burn repeatedly, reorganize itself with precision, and then fade away without a defining event, are we missing an entire category of causes in how ancient civilizations actually functioned and failed? Scattered archaeological surveys in the Highlands of Eritrea during the mid-20th century began documenting an unusual pattern of stone structures later grouped under what is now referred to as Adi Kawe ruins, a site located at elevations often exceeding 1,500 meters above sea level on a dry, wind-eroded plateau where preservation conditions are paradoxically both harsh and revealing. What drew attention was not monumental scale, but absence. No inscriptions, no carved iconography, no burial markers, and no clear stratified cultural layers typical of long-term settlement. And yet, across the terrain, archaeologists recorded carefully arranged stone constructions, including low walls, segmented enclosures, and geometric layouts that strongly suggest intentional planning rather than random accumulation. Early field notes compared the stonework loosely to proto-urban sites associated with the kingdom of Aksum, dated roughly between 100 and 700 CE. However, Adi Kawe did not conform to expected architectural or cultural patterns from that civilization. Radiocarbon dating from nearby organic traces such as charcoal fragments and soil residues suggests intermittent human activity, possibly ranging from the late 1st millennium BCE to early 1st millennium CE. But these samples remain sparse, fragmented, and spatially inconsistent. Unlike structured sites where occupation phases can be reconstructed layer by layer, Adi Kawe presents what researchers describe as a horizontal mystery, a landscape of structures without narrative depth. The central question emerges immediately. How can a constructed site exist without leaving behind the cultural signature of its builders? At first glance, the ruins appear primitive, consisting of dry stone walls assembled without mortar using locally sourced rock, but closer inspection reveals patterns that resist that classification. Measurements of surviving wall segments show relatively consistent stone sizing, often ranging between 20 to 40 centimeters in length, with flat contact surfaces that improve load distribution, while the alignment of stones suggests deliberate shaping rather than crude stacking. Some walls maintain structural integrity after centuries of erosion, indicating an understanding of weight balancing and lateral stability. This places Adi Kawe in an unusual comparative position. For instance, in Great Zimbabwe, dry stone construction reaches a high degree of sophistication with walls exceeding 10 meters in height and curvature engineered for stability, whereas Adi Kawe's walls are far smaller, rarely exceeding 1 meter, yet still exhibit proportional planning without scaling into monumental architecture. Similarly, at Nabta Playa, stone arrangements reflect astronomical alignments and ritual function, but Adi Kawe shows no confirmed celestial orientation, despite repeated attempts using GIS mapping and azimuth calculations. The contradiction becomes sharper. The builders understood basic engineering principles and applied them consistently across the site, yet they did not develop complexity, ornamentation, or symbolic layering. This is statistically unusual, because in most early societies, once structural competence is achieved, it correlates with population growth, ritual elaboration, or defensive architecture, but Adikawe demonstrates none of these trajectories. It is, in essence, a system that functioned without evolving. Aerial surveys and satellite mapping reveal that Adikawe is not random, as the layout includes clusters of enclosed spaces arranged in loose grids with pathways or corridors implied between them, while the density varies in a way that suggests zones of activity rather than uniform settlement. However, when archaeologists attempt to classify these zones, the interpretations collapse. No hearths have been definitively identified, no storage pits with preserved contents have been confirmed, and there is no concentration of tools or domestic debris. In established ancient settlements, whether in the Indus Valley, Mesopotamia, or East Africa, habitational areas typically leave behind micro-residues such as ash layers, pottery fragments, and faunal remains, meaning that even minimal occupation produces detectable archaeological signatures. Yet at Adikawe, such evidence is either absent or below meaningful thresholds. One hypothesis suggests that the site functioned as a transient aggregation point used seasonally by mobile populations, supported by ethnographic parallels in East Africa, where pastoral groups form temporary stone enclosures for livestock or communal gatherings, but those structures tend to be irregular and rapidly assembled rather than systematically arranged with geometric consistency. Another hypothesis proposes a ritual landscape without material symbolism, a space defined by movement and presence rather than objects, aligning loosely with certain prehistoric sites where ritual activity leaves minimal physical traces. Yet even in those cases, some markers such as post holes, altars, or deposition zones are usually present. Adikawe resists both categories, being too organized to be temporary, too empty to be permanent, and too structured to be accidental. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Adikawe is its temporal ambiguity. Most archaeological sites can be placed within a developmental sequence including early phase, expansion, peak and decline, reconstructed through stratigraphy, artifact typology, and radiometric dating. But at Adikawe, this sequence is missing. Instead, what appears is a discontinuous pattern consisting of isolated radiocarbon dates with wide error margins, a lack of overlapping occupation layers, and no clear evidence of construction phases or modifications over time. In statistical terms, this suggests either extremely short occupation or repeated use without cumulative buildup. When compared to Aksumite urban centers, where coinage, inscriptions, and unimported goods allow precise chronological mapping, or even to smaller sites that typically show at least 2 or 3 occupation layers over centuries, Adikawe shows none. It is as if the site was used and then abandoned without transition, with no destruction layer, no signs of conflict, and no environmental catastrophe recorded in the soil profile. From a systems perspective, this resembles what archaeologists describe as a non-linear occupation event, a phenomenon where human activity occurs without leaving a sustained archaeological footprint, which is rare and often associated with highly mobile or specialized groups, yet the scale of Adikawe complicates this explanation. The broader implication of Adikawe is not limited to one site, but extends to what it represents in the archaeological record of the Horn of Africa. The region is known to have supported complex societies long before the rise of Aksum, with trade networks connecting it to the Red Sea, Arabia, and the Nile Valley. Yet many of these early phases remain poorly documented due to limited excavation and preservation challenges. Adikawe may be part of this hidden layer, suggesting the possibility of a cultural system that operated without leaving durable artifacts. This challenges a fundamental assumption in archaeology that complexity correlates with material output, because if a society organizes space and constructs stable architecture while minimizing or avoiding artifact production, it becomes nearly invisible to conventional methods. Such a model would explain the structured layout without associated objects, the absence of inscriptions or symbolic markers, and the lack of long-term accumulation, but it also raises deeper questions about intentionality and purpose. Why would a society build in stone yet leave no message? Why invest labor in structure without embedding identity into it? And why create a place that does not explain itself? So what do you think Adikawe really was? A settlement, a ritual site, or something we still don't have the tools to understand? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tonnenar was not discovered in the dramatic, sudden way many ancient sites were. Instead, it emerged gradually from obscurity in the late 19th century, when explorers moving through the remote Ocosingo Valley in the highlands of Chiapas, southern Mexico, began documenting unusually massive stone terraces rising from the jungle floor. Early reports by researchers such as Desiree Charnay in the 1880s described a structure that did not resemble a conventional Maya city. What stood before them was not a spread of temples and plazas, but a single immense vertical formation. Later excavations throughout the 20th century, particularly those led by Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History, revealed the full scale of the site. A towering acropolis rising over 70 meters in height, composed of at least 7 superimposed terraces, making it one of the tallest structures in the entire Maya world. From the moment its layout became clear, Tonnenar presented a problem that has never been fully resolved. Unlike major centers such as Tikal or Palenque, which expand horizontally across wide ceremonial plazas, Tonnenar compresses its entire ceremonial and political core into a vertically stacked system. This is not a minor variation. It represents a complete departure from the spatial logic of Maya urbanism. The most immediate mystery is therefore structural. Why would a civilization known for expansive layouts choose instead to construct what is effectively a vertical city? The engineering implications alone are significant. Building upward at this scale in a tropical environment introduces challenges that horizontal cities largely avoid. Each terrace must support the cumulative weight of all structures above it, requiring precise load distribution across stone retaining walls. Archaeological analysis shows that these walls are not crude accumulations of rubble, but carefully constructed systems of fitted limestone blocks, some weighing hundreds of kilograms. The stability of the Acropolis over more than a millennium suggests a sophisticated understanding of pressure management and foundational support. Compared to other Maya constructions, where even modest pyramids required periodic reinforcement, Tonnenar's survival in a region with seasonal rainfall exceeding 2,000 millimeters per year is difficult to explain without assuming deliberate over-engineering. Even more striking is the issue of water control. In steep terraced environments, uncontrolled runoff typically leads to rapid erosion and structural collapse. Yet Tonnenar incorporates subtle but effective drainage solutions, channels carved into stone, angled surfaces that direct water away from critical joints, and layered platforms that reduce hydraulic pressure. When compared with sites like Copan, where erosion has significantly damaged architectural features despite less extreme verticality, Tonnenar appears disproportionately resilient. This raises a key question. Were its builders solving problems that did not yet exist, anticipating long-term environmental stress in a way that exceeds known Maya practices? The mystery deepens when examining how space is used within this vertical system. Movement through Tonnenar is not free or open. It is guided, constrained, and often deliberately disorienting. Staircases are steep and narrow, forcing single-direction flow. Terraces limit visibility, preventing large-scale observation of ceremonies from a single vantage point. This contrasts sharply with the open plazas of sites like Chichén Itzá, where architecture is designed to accommodate large audiences and communal viewing. At Tonnenar, spatial design appears to control not just movement but perception itself. This controlled environment becomes particularly significant when considering the site's massive ball court, one of the largest in Mesoamerica. Measuring over 100 meters in length, the court is embedded within the architectural framework rather than placed in an open civic space. Its elongated, enclosed design restricts both participation and observation, suggesting that the ballgame here may have functioned differently than at other Maya centers. While traditionally interpreted as a ritual tied to cosmology and myth, at Tonnenar, it may have served as a form of controlled political performance, an event where outcomes and interpretations were tightly managed by elite authority. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Tonnenar is renowned for its unusually explicit sculptural program, which emphasizes domination, captivity, and violence. Numerous monuments depict bound prisoners, decapitated figures, and victorious rulers standing over defeated enemies. These are not abstract representations of power. They are direct, almost confrontational statements. Inscriptions found at the site document repeated military conflicts, particularly with nearby Palenque, one of Tonnenar's primary rivals during the Classic period. Epigraphic studies indicate that Tonnenar may have captured and even executed high-ranking individuals from competing cities, reinforcing its political dominance through both action and imagery. What makes this significant is not merely the presence of violence, but its integration into the architecture itself. At Tonnenar, power is not confined to monuments or inscriptions, it is embedded into the physical experience of the site. As one ascends the terraces, the combination of steep elevation, restricted movement, and constant visual reminders of conquest creates an environment that may have been designed to influence psychological response. In this sense, the Acropolis functions less like a ceremonial center and more like a controlled spatial narrative, guiding individuals through a sequence of experiences that reinforce authority. Yet even this interpretation leaves critical questions unanswered. If Tonnenar was primarily a political instrument, why invest such extraordinary effort into vertical construction rather than more conventional displays of power? If it was defensive in nature, why does it lack many of the features typically associated with fortifications, such as perimeter walls or strategic lookout points? And if it was purely ceremonial, why does its engineering exceed the practical requirements of ritual use? Some researchers have proposed that Tonnenar represents a localized architectural experiment, a deviation driven by regional conditions or specific cultural priorities. Others suggest that its design reflects a symbolic attempt to replicate sacred mountains, aligning the city with cosmological beliefs about the layered structure of the universe. However, these explanations remain partial. Neither fully accounts for the combination of advanced engineering, spatial control, and aggressive iconography that defines the site. In comparative terms, Tonnenar occupies an unusual position within the Maya world. It is neither the largest nor the most artistically refined site, yet it demonstrates a level of structural ambition that rivals or exceeds more famous centers. Its verticality has few parallels, and its integration of architecture, engineering, and political messaging appears unusually cohesive. This combination suggests that Tonnenar was not simply following established traditions, but actively redefining them. Ultimately, the greatest mystery of Tonnenar may not lie in any single feature, but in the convergence of all its anomalies. It is a site where architectural form, environmental adaptation, and ideological expression intersect in ways that challenge existing models of Maya civilization. Despite decades of excavation and analysis, no single framework has been able to fully explain its design. Tolinar stands, therefore, as more than an archaeological site. It is a question in stone, one that forces us to reconsider what ancient cities were meant to be and whether some of them were built not just to function, but to shape how people think, move, and perceive power itself. Eastern Oklahoma, near the Arkansas River. A series of low grass-covered earth mounds stretch across what appears to be an unremarkable landscape. But in the early 1930s, treasure hunters working without archaeological oversight dug into the largest structure, now known as Craig Mound. What they uncovered was not simply a burial site, but a sealed chamber containing one of the most extensive collections of pre-Columbian artifacts ever found in North America. Inside, thousands of objects lay preserved: carved shell ornaments, copper plates, stone pipes, woven textiles, even organic materials that should have decomposed within decades. Radiocarbon dating later placed the primary occupation of the site between approximately 800 and 1450 CE within the broader Mississippian cultural horizon. Yet the most unsettling detail was not the age, but the condition. In a humid subtropical climate where organic matter typically decays rapidly, entire assemblages remained intact, as if time had been selectively suspended. Compared to Cahokia Mounds, the largest known Mississippian center, Spiro was smaller in scale. But while Cahokia reveals urban planning and monumental architecture, Spiro reveals something more elusive: a concentration of material precision and symbolic complexity that appears disproportionate to its size. From the moment of its discovery, the question was no longer what Spiro was, but how it functioned at a level that defies its technological context. Among the thousands of artifacts recovered, the most perplexing are the engraved shell objects, commonly referred to as gorgets, crafted primarily from marine shells sourced from the Gulf of Mexico, over 600 kilometers away. At first glance, they appear decorative, but under magnification, they reveal something far more precise. The engraved lines are consistently narrow, often less than 1 millimeter in width, with depths that remain uniform across complex curves and intersecting geometries. Experimental archaeology has attempted to replicate these patterns using tools consistent with the Mississippian toolkit: stone blades, bone awls, sharpened reeds. The results fall short. Even under controlled conditions, reproductions show microfracturing, irregular depth variation, and inconsistent curvature. The originals do not. Some motifs exhibit radial symmetry with angular deviations measured at less than 2 degrees. Others demonstrate repeated geometric spacing that implies either measurement or an internalized proportional system. In modern manufacturing terms, this level of repeatability approaches what would be expected from guided tooling rather than freehand carving. The problem is not that ancient artisans lacked skill. Comparable cultures, such as the Maya or later Mesoamerican societies, produced highly refined carvings in jade, obsidian, and bone. But even at their most intricate, those works retained subtle irregularities consistent with manual execution. At Spiro, the engravings approach a threshold where variability becomes statistically minimal. Microscopic analysis of tool marks suggests controlled pressure application, with no evidence of chipping or overcutting at intersections, an anomaly when working with brittle calcium carbonate shells. This implies not only precision in motion, but precision in force, something extremely difficult to achieve without feedback mechanisms or specialized tools. The question becomes unavoidable. Why would a society invest this level of technical refinement into objects whose primary function appears ceremonial? One hypothesis proposes that these artifacts were not merely decorative, but encoded. The recurring motifs, interlocking spirals, cross-in-circle forms, avian-human hybrids are associated with the southeastern ceremonial complex, a symbolic system believed to reflect cosmological beliefs. However, when analyzed structurally, some patterns reveal proportional relationships that remain consistent across multiple artifacts, suggesting a standardized design framework rather than individual artistic interpretation. Another layer of complexity emerges when considering production logistics. Marine shells had to be transported inland, across vast distances without wheeled vehicles or large draft animals. Once acquired, they were shaped, polished, and engraved with extreme care. The failure rate for such brittle material, even with modern tools, would be significant. Yet the archaeological record shows a high proportion of successfully completed pieces. If these were purely ritual items, the efficiency of their production and the consistency of their execution suggests a system optimized beyond symbolic necessity. Shell, as a material, presents a paradox. It is both rigid and fragile, composed primarily of calcium carbonate arranged in micro-layered structures. Under stress, it tends to fracture unpredictably, especially when incised. Modern material science shows that maintaining a consistent incision depth without inducing cracks requires either extremely fine control or preconditioning of the material. There is no direct evidence that Spiro artisans heat-treated or chemically altered shells. However, the absence of fracture propagation in many artifacts suggests either an advanced empirical understanding of the material or a technique that has not yet been identified. Comparative experiments indicate that even slight variations in applied force on the order of a few newtons can result in visible defects. Yet the Spiro engravings maintain structural integrity across entire surfaces, including regions of high curvature where stress concentration would normally increase. This raises a deeper question. Were these artisans operating purely through learned skill, or did they possess a form of tacit knowledge accumulated through generations that effectively functioned as a material science without formal theory? The shell artifacts do not exist in isolation. They are part of a broader system of exchange that brought materials from distant regions into a centralized context. Copper from the Great Lakes, stone from the Appalachian region, and marine shells from the Gulf Coast all converge at Spiro. What is unusual is not the existence of trade networks. These are well documented in prehistoric North America, but the level of standardization observed in the final products. Artifacts from different time layers and contexts exhibit consistent design principles suggesting either centralized production or strict cultural transmission protocols. In industrial terms, this resembles quality control. Yet there is no evidence of workshops, no standardized toolkits recovered, and no written instructions. The knowledge system that enabled such consistency appears to have been entirely embedded in practice. If precision like this can emerge without metal tools or formal measurement systems, are we looking at the peak of human craftsmanship, or the remains of a knowledge system we no longer understand? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. At more than 3,600 meters above sea level, where oxygen thins and agriculture becomes uncertain, an entire stone complex stretches across a narrow ridge for over 3 kilometers, massive walls, circular enclosures, and layered sectors built with a level of coordination that should not belong to a culture barely recorded in history. In northern Peru's La Libertad region, Macahuamachuco was first noted by Spanish chroniclers in the 16th century. but only in the 20th century did systematic surveys begin to reveal its true scale. Not a ruin, but a structured highland system whose size rivals major Andean centers. The immediate anomaly is not its existence, but its mismatch with everything around it. Attributed to the Huamachuco culture between the 4th and 8th centuries CE, the site expands to a scale comparable to Machu Picchu or even parts of Chan Chan, yet it operates outside any known imperial network. With no written system, no clear political lineage, and no surviving narrative to explain how such a structure came into being. What investigators encountered was not a single city, but a fragmented network of sectors. Cerro del Castillo, Las Monjas, El Castillo, each composed of massive stone enclosures, elongated corridors, and striking circular compounds. These were not scattered ruins. They were deliberately organized, repeating architectural units, suggesting a high degree of planning. Yet, unlike later Inca urbanism, which exhibits clear administrative zoning and integration with road systems such as the Q-Hapak-Nian, Marca Huamachuco appears spatially isolated. Its location alone raises logistical questions. Transporting construction materials, sustaining a population, and maintaining structural integrity at this altitude would have required a level of coordination that implies a complex socio-political system, one that has almost entirely vanished from the historical record. The construction techniques deepen the mystery. The site's walls, in some cases reaching heights of 8 to 10 meters, are built using dry stone masonry stones, stacked without mortar, yet many remain stable after more than 1,500 years of exposure to wind erosion. Thermal variation, and seismic activity typical of the Andes. Unlike the precisely interlocking polygonal stones seen at Sacsayhuaman, Marca Huamachuco's masonry is less refined in finish but remarkably consistent across large surfaces. This suggests a different engineering priority, not perfection at the micro scale, but repeatability and scalability across vast areas. Experimental archaeology indicates that dry stone walls of this thickness can distribute stress efficiently, but only if the internal packing and weight distribution are carefully controlled. The question is not whether ancient builders could achieve this. It is why they chose this method at such a scale, in a region where finer masonry traditions later emerged. Even more perplexing are the circular structures scattered throughout the site. Some of these enclosures measure up to 20 or 30 meters in diameter, enclosed by thick perimeter walls and often grouped in clusters. In Andean archaeology, circular forms are typically associated with storage facilities known as kolkas, used extensively by the Inca for preserving maize and potatoes. However, standard kolkas are significantly smaller, optimized for airflow and modular distribution. The structures at Marca Huamachuco exceed those dimensions by several orders of magnitude, making a purely utilitarian interpretation inefficient. Alternative hypotheses suggest ceremonial use, but unlike ritual centers such as Chavin de Huanta, there is a notable absence of iconography, carvings, or symbolic orientation tied to cosmological alignments. The architecture communicates intention, but not meaning. Archaeological surveys have also revealed evidence of controlled burning in specific sectors, along with human remains positioned in ways that do not conform to typical burial practices of the region. Some bodies appear to have been deposited rapidly, possibly during episodes of conflict or ritual activity, yet there is no widespread destruction layer consistent with large-scale warfare. This creates a paradox: localized violence or ceremonial burning without evidence of external invasion. In comparative terms, sites like Wari show clearer patterns of expansion, conflict, and eventual decline tied to environmental stress and political fragmentation. Marca Huamachuco, by contrast, seems to have undergone a more ambiguous transformation. Parts of it abandoned, parts reused, but never fully integrated into subsequent imperial systems. Population estimates further complicate interpretation. Based on spatial analysis and architectural density, some researchers suggest that the site could have supported several thousand inhabitants at its peak. However, the absence of extensive domestic structures such as hearths, waste deposits, and agricultural terraces directly adjacent to the core complexes suggests that it may not have functioned as a conventional residential city. Instead, it may have served as a periodic gathering site, a regional administrative hub, or even a ceremonial center operating on a seasonal basis. This would align with patterns observed in other pre-Inca societies, where mobility and ritual congregation played a central role in social organization. But again, the scale of Marca Huamachuco exceeds what is typically required for such functions. One of the most debated questions is why the site was ultimately abandoned. Radiocarbon dating places its decline around the 8th to 9th centuries CE, a period marked by broader climatic fluctuations in the Andes, including episodes of drought. Environmental stress could have undermined agricultural productivity, forcing populations to relocate. Yet if climate were the primary factor, one would expect similar abandonment patterns across comparable highland sites. Instead, Marca Huamachuco appears unusually complete in its desertion structures left standing, not systematically dismantled or repurposed. Later Inca presence is documented, but limited. They occupied portions of the site, modified certain areas, but did not expand or fully integrate it into their administrative network. For a civilization known for absorbing and optimizing existing infrastructure, this selective use is difficult to explain. From a broader perspective, Marca Huamachuco challenges conventional models of Andean development. It suggests the existence of a regional power center operating independently, with architectural capabilities and organizational complexity that rival contemporaneous cultures, yet without leaving behind the cultural markers writing, iconography, extensive material culture that typically allow archaeologists to reconstruct identity and function. In this sense, it resembles a structural ghost, a place defined by what was built rather than by what was recorded. The unresolved questions are not minor gaps in knowledge, they are structural uncertainties. Why construct massive circular enclosures that do not align with known economic or ritual functions? How did a society without a clearly documented hierarchy coordinate labor at this scale? And perhaps most importantly, why does a site of this magnitude leave behind so little narrative evidence compared to its architectural footprint? In archaeology, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but at Marca Huamachuco, the absence itself becomes part of the mystery. Standing on that ridge, surrounded by walls that have outlasted empires, the site does not present itself as a ruin of something understood. It presents itself as a system we have not yet decoded. The emergence of complex societies is often placed somewhere between survival and coincidence. Simple shelters, gradual experimentation, and slow technological progress. But at Duranculac Archaeological Complex, along the western edge of the Black Sea, that narrative breaks down completely. Here, on a small island beside a shallow coastal lake, archaeologists uncovered a settlement that does not behave like a typical early society. Stone architecture appears with a level of stability far beyond expectation. Spatial organization shows clear, intentional design, and most unsettling of all, gold appears centuries earlier than metallurgy should have developed. This is not just an ancient site. It is a paradox embedded directly within the timeline of human development, where what we think we understand about the progression of civilization begins to lose certainty. The site at Duranculac was first systematically excavated in the 1970s, with major work led by Bulgarian archaeologist Henrietta Todorova. What began as a routine survey of prehistoric remains quickly expanded into one of the most significant Neolithic and Chalcolithic excavations in Europe. Beneath layers of sediment, researchers uncovered over 20 habitation phases, spanning from approximately 7,000 to 5,000 years before the Common Era. Alongside these layers lay an extensive necropolis, more than 1,000 burials, many containing objects that would challenge established timelines of early human technology. Most Neolithic settlements across Europe relied almost entirely on organic materials such as wood, reeds, and mud. These structures were inherently temporary, vulnerable to climate, decay, and environmental fluctuations. Yet Duranculac reveals a completely different approach. Houses here were constructed using carefully selected and deliberately arranged stone blocks, forming durable foundations that persisted across multiple occupation phases. Excavation data shows that many later structures were built directly on top of earlier ones, with minimal change in placement, indicating not only continuity of habitation, but also a certain level of understanding of load distribution and structural stability. The stones were not placed randomly. They were layered in ways that optimized durability, even in an environment subject to fluctuating water levels. When compared to sites like Çatalhöyük, which shares a similar age but relies primarily on mud brick, the difference becomes striking. Mud brick requires constant maintenance and frequent rebuilding, while stone foundations imply long-term architectural thinking. Yet the paradox remains. There is no evidence of advanced tools supporting this process. No developed metal instruments, no standardized measurement systems, and no recorded technical knowledge. The precision is clearly present, but the method behind it remains entirely unrecorded. The overall layout of Duranculac reveals an even more difficult to explain feature: intentional spatial planning. Houses were not built randomly, but arranged into clear clusters, separated by narrow pathways, suggesting a degree of control over movement and daily activity within the settlement. Certain areas appear to have been designated for specific functions such as storage, craft production, or communal use, indicating a structured division of space. This level of organization contradicts the common assumption that early societies built only in response to immediate needs without long-term planning. Instead, Duranculac exhibits characteristics of a proto-urban environment, where space was managed collectively and systematically. Similar patterns can be observed in later settlements across the Balkans and Anatolia, but rarely at such an early date. The absence of a writing system makes it difficult to determine how this planning was maintained. Was there a central authority, a shared cultural framework, or a system of oral knowledge passed down through generations without ever being recorded? The most profound anomaly at Duranculac lies beneath the ground, where its ancient necropolis contains evidence that could reshape our understanding of early metallurgy. Within this burial ground, one of the largest prehistoric cemeteries in Europe, archaeologists uncovered graves containing worked gold artifacts dating to approximately 5,500 years before the Common Era. These items include beads, pendants, and small decorative elements, many displaying remarkable symmetry and a level of refinement far beyond what is typically associated with early metallurgical experimentation. To fully grasp the significance, one must consider the technical requirements of gold working. Although gold has a relatively low melting point of around 1064 degrees Celsius, achieving and maintaining such temperatures requires controlled firing environments, knowledge of fuels and materials, and a basic understanding of metallurgical processes. These are not trivial achievements for a society without recorded science. The discoveries at Durankulac closely parallel those found at the nearby Varna necropolis, often regarded as the oldest gold treasure in the world. However, what makes Durankulac particularly intriguing is the distribution of its gold artifacts. They do not appear uniformly across all graves but are found selectively, suggesting early social stratification, a form of hierarchy emerging far earlier than traditionally accepted. Even more puzzling is the absence of clear evidence for large-scale metallurgical infrastructure. There are no definitive furnace systems, no significant slag deposits, and no confirmed workshop remains within the site. This leads to several possibilities. The gold may have been processed elsewhere and brought to Durankulac. Metallurgical activities may have occurred on a scale too small to leave clear traces, or entirely different techniques may have been used compared to later, more industrialized methods. When compared with other regions in Europe, where metal usage becomes widespread only centuries later, the presence of gold at Durankulac does not resemble an early experiment. It resembles a finished product. The implication is difficult to ignore. Either the timeline of metallurgical development is incomplete, or a form of knowledge once existed that did not spread in a linear manner and was eventually lost. The geographical location of Durankulac introduces yet another contradiction. Situated near a coastal lake connected to the Black Sea, the area is subject to seasonal flooding, fluctuations in salinity, and sediment movement conditions that typically make long-term settlement difficult or unsustainable. And yet, archaeological evidence indicates continuous habitation over several millennia. Geological studies suggest that the inhabitants may have adapted by subtly modifying their environment, such as raising foundations, selecting slightly elevated locations, and possibly reinforcing soil layers to improve stability. However, the scale of these interventions appears small relative to the environmental challenges. This implies that the inhabitants of Durankulac may have possessed a level of environmental understanding far beyond simple trial and error survival. They did not merely adapt to their surroundings, they appear to have anticipated and managed them in a systematic way. When considered individually, each feature of Durankulac can be explained within certain limits: stone construction, spatial planning, early metallurgy, and environmental adaptation. But when all these elements are viewed together, they form a pattern that does not align with the traditional model of gradual human development. There is no clear transitional phase leading to this level of complexity, nor evidence of slow accumulation from simpler systems. Instead, Durankulac appears with a notable degree of completeness in multiple aspects, as if it inherited knowledge rather than developed it step by step. This directly challenges one of the most fundamental assumptions in archaeology, that human progress follows a linear and continuous path. So what do you think? Are we underestimating ancient knowledge, or is something in the historical timeline fundamentally missing? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Production on an industrial scale is not supposed to exist in the 5th millennium BCE, not in Europe, not before cities, before states, before writing. Yet at Provadia, a settlement dated to roughly 4,700 to 4,200 BCE, archaeologists uncovered something that behaves less like a village and more like a controlled production system. One that turns underground brine into standardized units of salt, protects them behind massive stone fortifications, and distributes them across regions hundreds of kilometers away. If correct, this site does not just precede early urban economies, it quietly contradicts them. The site, often referred to as Solnitsata, was systematically excavated beginning in the early 21st century under Bulgarian archaeologist Vasil Nikolov. Stratigraphic analysis, radiocarbon dating, and ceramic typology placed its primary occupation firmly in the late Neolithic to Chalcolithic transition. Beneath successive habitation layers, researchers identified brine extraction pits, ceramic installations for evaporation, and thick defensive walls elements that, when combined, suggested a specialized production center rather than a typical settlement. Salt, in prehistory, was not merely a dietary supplement, it was a biological necessity. Without it, human survival becomes difficult. Without preservation, food systems collapse. This transforms salt into one of the earliest strategic resources in human history. At Provadia, the scale of production appears to exceed local consumption by a significant margin. Ceramic molds suggest salt was formed into standardized blocks, likely for transport and exchange, indicating a system of measurable output and possibly even value equivalence. Experimental reconstructions estimate that a single evaporation cycle could yield several kilograms of salt per vessel, and with dozens, perhaps hundreds of vessels operating, output could plausibly reach hundreds of kilograms per production phase. This is not subsistence, this is surplus. When compared to sites like Çatalhöyük, where population density was high but economic activity remained decentralized, or Jericho, where fortifications existed without clear industrial specialization, Provadia stands apart. Here, the settlement appears to be structured around a single resource, not agriculture, not trade hubs, but salt. This raises a critical implication. Provadia may represent one of the earliest known examples of a mono-resource economy, where control over a single commodity shapes the entire social and spatial organization of a community. At its core, the technology is deceptively simple. Brine is extracted from underground sources. It is poured into ceramic vessels. Heat is applied until water evaporates, leaving behind crystallized salt. This method is known across cultures and persists even in traditional salt making today. But simplicity collapses under scale. To evaporate 1 liter of water requires approximately 2,260 kilojoules of energy. Even if we assume partial efficiency, scaling this process to hundreds of liters per day would demand an enormous and continuous fuel supply. Archaeobotanical evidence, however, indicates that the surrounding environment could not have supported long-term deforestation at the level required. The numbers do not align. The energy input appears insufficient for the output observed. This contradiction is central to the mystery. The ceramics complicate it further. Vessels found at Provadia display high uniformity in dimensions and composition, suggesting controlled production techniques. Many show signs of repeated heating cycles without significant degradation, implying a level of thermal engineering not typically associated with Neolithic craftsmanship. Modern experimental attempts to replicate these vessels often result in cracking or structural failure after limited use, raising the possibility that ancient producers had developed material optimization strategies that are not fully understood. Spatial layout adds another layer. The positioning of kilns, brine sources, and working areas suggest deliberate planning. Heat transfer appears to be optimized. Movement appears minimized. Some researchers have proposed multi-stage evaporation systems, where partially heated brine is transferred between vessels to reduce total energy consumption. Others suggest the use of thermal recycling, where residual heat from previous batches contributes to subsequent ones. There are even hypotheses, still speculative, that partial evaporation may have occurred before heating, perhaps through exposure to sun or wind, effectively reducing the energy required for final crystallization. If true, this would indicate a hybrid system, combining passive and active processes, an approach that resembles later industrial efficiency models. In isolation, each of these ideas is plausible. Together, they describe something unexpected, not just production, but process optimization. A system designed not only to function, but to function efficiently. Encircling this production zone are stone walls reaching up to 2 to 3 meters in thickness. For a settlement dated to the 5th millennium BCE, this is highly unusual. Most contemporary sites relied on wooden palisades or simple earthworks. Here, however, stone construction dominates, and not as a single barrier, but in multiple defensive layers. This suggests not only the presence of threat, but the anticipation of sustained conflict. What is being defended, however, appears less like residential space and more like infrastructure. Brine wells, evaporation installations, and production zones are positioned within protected areas. This implies that the value lies not just in stored goods, but in the means of production itself. Such an arrangement aligns with later economic systems, where control over production sites, mines, workshops, factories becomes more critical than control over territory alone. In this sense, Provadia may represent an early example of infrastructure-centered defense, where economic assets dictate military architecture. Nearby burial complexes provide evidence of social differentiation. Grave goods include copper implements and, in the broader regional context, connections to sites like Varna Necropolis reveal the presence of gold artifacts dated to around 4500 BCE, the earliest known worked gold in the world. Gold, unlike salt, is not a necessity. It is symbolic. Its presence signals hierarchy, status, and accumulated wealth. The coexistence of large-scale salt production and early gold use suggests a relationship that surplus generated from salt may have enabled the emergence of elite classes capable of controlling and displaying wealth. This disrupts traditional models, which often place the rise of social stratification after the development of large agricultural surpluses. Provadia suggests an alternative pathway, one where resource specialization, not agriculture alone, drives inequality. When all elements are considered together, standardized production, energy-intensive processes, optimized spatial organization, defensive infrastructure, and evidence of wealth concentration, Provadia begins to resemble something that should not yet exist, a proto-industrial system. Not industrial in the modern sense, but organized, measured, reproducible. The implications extend beyond the site itself. If such systems could emerge under specific conditions, access to valuable resources, environmental constraints, and accumulated practical knowledge, then technological complexity may not follow a single linear path. Instead, it may appear in isolated peaks, rising quickly, operating efficiently, and then disappearing, leaving only fragments behind. Provadia may be one such peak. Is Provadia just a rare anomaly, or could it be the surviving trace of multiple advanced civilizations that disappeared from history? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Beneath the floors of ordinary houses in Bronze Age Iberia, the dead were placed with a precision that feels disturbingly modern, measured, repeated, and controlled across centuries without a visible system to sustain it. The burial practices of El Argar were first systematically identified in the late 19th century by Belgian engineers Henri Siret and Louis Siret during mining surveys in southeastern Spain. Excavations at sites such as La Bastida and La Almoloya revealed an unexpected pattern. Individuals buried directly beneath domestic floors, often inside large ceramic jars, accompanied by standardized sets of objects. Over time, more than 1,000 burials have been documented, allowing archaeologists to identify recurring structural and material consistencies that define the culture. At first glance, burying the dead beneath houses might appear to be a cultural or symbolic decision, yet the technical implications are far more complex. These burials required cutting into compacted soil, placing a body or container, and resealing the ground directly under load-bearing structures, a process that in modern engineering would be considered highly destabilizing if not carefully controlled. Even small voids beneath a foundation today can compromise structural integrity, yet at El Argar sites, there is little archaeological evidence of widespread subsidence or collapse, suggesting that the inhabitants understood whether intuitively or systematically how to maintain soil stability over long periods. Excavation records indicate that burial pits were often carefully shaped and in some cases subtly reinforced by surrounding materials, distributing pressure in a way that reduced stress concentration. The repeated success of this method across generations implies a form of empirical geotechnical knowledge that functioned reliably without formal theory. Compared to contemporaneous settlements in regions such as Mesopotamia or the Aegean, where burials were typically separated from domestic architecture, El Argar demonstrates a rare integration of mortuary practice and structural design. The central question remains unresolved. How could a society without formal engineering tools maintain such consistent ground stability under repeated disturbance over centuries? A defining feature of El Argar burials is the use of large ceramic vessels, commonly referred to as pithoi, which were not merely symbolic containers but engineered objects designed to enclose entire human bodies while resisting the compressive forces of surrounding soil. Producing ceramics of this size introduces significant technical challenges, as experimental archaeology has shown that firing large vessels without cracking requires maintaining stable temperatures in the range of approximately 700 to 900 degrees Celsius, along with carefully controlled heating and cooling cycles. In primitive kiln environments, such control is extremely difficult, because uneven heat distribution typically results in structural fractures. Despite this, microstructural analyses of El Argar ceramics reveal remarkable uniformity, with clay matrices showing consistent vitrification levels that indicate stable firing conditions across different production batches. When compared to pottery from other Bronze Age European contexts, which often exhibits irregular firing patterns and visible weaknesses, El Argar ceramics stand out for their reliability and consistency. This creates a technical paradox. Either El Argar potters developed kiln architectures or firing methodologies that have not yet been fully reconstructed, or they possessed a level of process control that exceeds what is typically attributed to societies of this period, suggesting a hidden layer of technological knowledge embedded within seemingly simple craft traditions. The most striking anomaly within El Argar burials lies in their metal artifacts, where swords, daggers, axes, and ornaments, particularly finely crafted silver diadems, appear with a level of consistency and precision that challenges conventional assumptions about Bronze Age metallurgy. Metallurgical analyses have demonstrated that many bronze objects from El Argar maintain relatively stable alloy compositions, often within narrow ranges of copper and tin ratios, a degree of consistency rarely observed in early Bronze Age contexts, where variations in ore sources, smelting conditions, and casting methods typically produce significant fluctuations in material quality. One of the most discussed examples is the set of bronze swords recovered from elite burials, which exhibit not only near-perfect symmetry but also carefully balanced weight distribution, with centers of mass falling within a narrow functional range that would enhance handling efficiency in combat scenarios. However, many of these weapons show minimal wear, indicating that they were not extensively used in practice, which introduces a fundamental contradiction. If these objects were primarily symbolic, the level of technical refinement invested in them appears excessive. Yet if they were functional, their lack of wear suggests limited application. The mystery deepens with the discovery of high-status silver objects at La Almoloya, where a burial containing an intricately shaped silver diadem revealed metallurgical capabilities rarely documented in Western Europe during this period, including high levels of material purity and precise shaping techniques that imply advanced control over smelting and cold working processes. When compared to contemporaneous regions such as Mycenaean Greece, where metal artifacts demonstrate high craftsmanship but greater variability in production quality, or Central Europe, where bronze casting often shows inconsistencies in finishing, El Argar stands out for its apparent standardization and repeatability. Some researchers have proposed that this pattern reflects a centralized production system in which metallurgical knowledge, raw materials, and manufacturing processes were tightly controlled, effectively forming an early proto-industrial network centuries before such systems are typically recognized in European prehistory. Yet this interpretation remains incomplete, as there is little direct evidence of large-scale workshops, formal measurement systems, or written records that would normally support such precision, leaving open the possibility that the mechanisms behind this level of control were fundamentally different from later technological systems. The burials of El Argar reveal a clear social structure, expressed not only through grave goods but also through the precise arrangement of space and materials, where high-status individuals are consistently associated with specific combinations of artifacts, burial positions, and container types. What stands out is the consistency of these patterns across multiple sites and generations, indicating the existence of a shared framework that regulated these practices with minimal variation. Unlike many civilizations that expressed hierarchy through large monuments such as pyramids, El Argar encoded status on a smaller scale but with greater precision, functioning almost like a standardized material language. Maintaining this level of consistency without written records suggests the presence of effective knowledge transmission mechanisms, allowing the entire system to operate with stability similar to a tightly controlled process. Individually, each aspect of El Argar soil management, ceramics, metallurgy, and social organization fits within known Bronze Age capabilities. What makes it unusual is their integration into a single, highly consistent system sustained over centuries, with standardized burials, controlled production, and stable social patterns. In modern terms, this resembles a system with quality control and process standardization, yet the expected infrastructure such as written records, precise tools, or large-scale workshops is largely absent, leaving a gap between what was achieved and how it was done. If a Bronze Age society could achieve this level of precision without the tools we consider essential, what other forms of knowledge or technology might ancient civilizations have developed that we have yet to fully recognize? In northern Poland, on the marshy shores of Lake Biskupin, lies one of the most unsettling archaeological contradictions in Europe, Biskupin. Dating to around the 8th century BCE, this settlement should have been primitive, temporary, and structurally inconsistent, like most Iron Age communities across Central Europe. Yet what archaeologists uncovered was something disturbingly precise. A fully planned settlement laid out in a geometric grid, with nearly identical houses, standardized streets, and a defensive perimeter, all constructed entirely from wood. And the mystery is not simply that Biskupin exists, but that it exhibits a level of planning, measurement, and execution that appears disproportionate to the tools, materials, and technological framework of its time. Biskupin was discovered in 1933 when unusually low water levels in Lake Biskupin exposed rows of wooden posts, and a local schoolteacher named Walenti Swaiger recognized their unnatural alignment and alerted archaeologists, leading to excavations directed by Józef Kostrevski that soon revealed an entire submerged settlement remarkably preserved beneath layers of peat and waterlogged sediment, while dendrochronological analysis, or tree ring dating, later confirmed that many of the oak timbers used in construction were felled around 748 BCE, with variations of only a few years, a level of synchronization that strongly implies coordinated, large-scale construction rather than gradual organic growth. And because the waterlogged conditions created an anaerobic environment that prevented decay, thousands of wooden elements including walls, streets, foundations, and even structural joinery survived, making Biskupin fundamentally different from most prehistoric European settlements, where only post holes or soil discolorations remain, effectively turning the site into a frozen architectural blueprint rather than a fragmented ruin. The settlement covers approximately 2 hectares and consists of roughly 100 houses arranged in parallel rows, with 11 streets, each about 2.5 to 3 meters wide, running between them in a near-perfect grid, and each house measuring approximately 8 to 9 meters in length and 6 to 8 meters in width with minimal variation, a degree of uniformity that is statistically improbable in a society lacking written architectural plans or standardized measurement tools, especially when compared to most contemporary Lusatian culture settlements, which typically display irregular layouts shaped by terrain and gradual expansion. And even early Mediterranean urban centers of the same era rarely exhibit such strict orthogonality, leading to the conclusion that Biskupin was not built incrementally over generations, but instead planned, measured, and executed as a single coordinated project. Wood is inherently vulnerable to rot, insects, and environmental degradation. Yet at Biskupin, more than 2,000 years later, thousands of wooden elements remain intact, and scientific analysis suggests that the builders primarily used oak, a hardwood known for its durability, placing it in water-saturated soil where oxygen levels were low enough to inhibit microbial decomposition. But the deeper question remains unresolved, because if the builders intentionally selected such an environment to preserve their structures, then their understanding of ecological conditions would reflect a level of environmental engineering rarely attributed to Iron Age societies. Whereas if this preservation was accidental, then Biskupin represents an extraordinary convergence of natural conditions that happen to protect a complex settlement in remarkable detail, and when compared to similar wooden settlements in Germany and Scandinavia from the same period that have almost entirely vanished, leaving only fragmented traces, Biskupin's preservation stands out as either a deliberate strategy or an unlikely anomaly. The most unsettling aspect of Biskupin lies in its construction techniques, where wooden beams show evidence of careful shaping, consistent dimensions, and tightly fitted joints, with horizontal logs interlocked with vertical posts through joinery methods that minimize gaps and enhance structural stability. Yet the tools available at the time were limited primarily to bronze or early iron implements such as axes, adzes, and chisels that lack the hardness and precision of later steel tools, meaning that achieving consistent cuts across hundreds of structural elements would have required not only exceptional craftsmanship, but also some form of standardized measurement and replication system. And experimental archaeology attempting to reproduce Biskupin-style construction using period-accurate tools has demonstrated that while individual components can indeed be created, maintaining uniformity across an entire settlement is extremely labor-intensive and prone to cumulative error, which raises critical questions about how builders were able to maintain dimensional consistency across approximately 100 houses, whether they employed a predefined unit of measurement or whether they relied on templates, marking systems, or shared calibration techniques that have left no archaeological trace. And although later civilizations such as ancient China and Japan developed precise wooden joinery supported by formalized carpentry traditions and written knowledge systems, Biskupin predates these developments in Europe, while still demonstrating comparable precision, leaving a significant gap between known technological capability and observed execution. Biskupin was constructed on what was effectively an artificial island, reinforced by thousands of wooden piles driven into soft waterlogged ground, on top of which builders layered horizontal timbers, branches, and compacted earth to create a stable platform, a method that closely resembles a primitive form of pile foundation used in modern engineering to support structures on unstable soils. And because load distribution across such a system requires an understanding, whether intuitive or empirical, of weight, pressure, and ground response, the fact that archaeological evidence shows no major structural collapse suggests that the builders achieved a functional balance despite the challenging environment. And although similar foundation techniques appear in later historical contexts such as Venice or medieval waterfront construction, these examples are separated from Biskupin by more than 1,000 years, making it difficult to explain how such an approach was conceived and executed at this scale without formal engineering theory. Underlying all technical aspects of Biskupin is the question of organization, because constructing such a settlement would have required coordinated labor involving hundreds or even thousands of individuals, with timber needing to be sourced, processed, transported, and assembled within a relatively narrow time frame as suggested by dendrochronological clustering, implying the presence of centralized decision-making, logistical planning, resource allocation, and a shared architectural vision. Yet there is little evidence of hierarchical monuments, elite residences, or written records that would typically indicate a governing authority comparable to later urban societies, resulting in a paradox where Biskupin appears both egalitarian in its uniform layout and highly organized in its execution, challenging conventional assumptions about the social complexity of early European communities. So what do you think, was Biskupin an isolated breakthrough of ancient ingenuity, or evidence of a lost system of knowledge we no longer understand? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below,